Hey guys, I'm Yuruzi. Part 3 of What If Naruto Was the Red Flash. Naruto finds out about Uzumaki clan when he was 4 years old. Naruto swears to rebuild the home of his clan and finds all the family he has left. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 17, Phoenix. Naruto, after 2 years. It had been 2 years since Naruto had arrived on Mount Myoboku. He had started training a week again after he had arrived, first only chakra control, and Jiraiya-sensei would throw things at him sometimes when they were training him. Naruto couldn't remember the last time he felt so happy. Not being in the village and seeing him as a monster for 2 years helped. A part of Naruto wasn't really looking forward to going back to the village. He knew that the people there had not forgotten about him despite not being in the village. Toji would visit every 4 to 6 months and stay for mainly 3 weeks. Naruto liked his company. Fukasaku-sama and Ma-san were good company as well. But Naruto spent the time mainly with Fukasaku since he was training him in taijutsu. Naruto had met different toads that lived here, like the head of the toads, Gabamunta. He found him funny but sometimes really annoying. His son Gamakichi, who was a friend to Naruto. Within the last 2 years, Naruto had trained and learned quite a few useful jutsus. Naruto hadn't made much progress when it came to his wood style since he had no scrolls to help him, and no one was around to teach him in wood style. But Naruto was able to do 2 wood style jutsus. Wood style, ground spike. B rank. A jutsu that made wood spikes grow from the ground around the area the user chooses can grow as large as the amount of chakra that the user uses. Wood style, wooden cage. C rank, B rank. It creates a cage used to trap the enemy. The woods can come out from Naruto's sleeves or from trees nearby. It can be grown from the ground, but it requires more chakra. The cage can absorb the chakra of whoever is inside at a plodding pace. When it came to his chakra control, he now could keep a leaf on his forehead, keep 5 kunai on the point of his fingers, and stay upside down in a tree, and sometimes the same while staying on the water. Now Fukasaku-sama started training him in taijutsu, running around the mountain like a slave, 200 runs without stopping, wearing weights that were 50 pounds on his legs and 30 pounds on his arms. Toji always said that he would get stronger with a lot of push-ups, sit-ups, and plenty of juice. Strong like his father and mother. Naruto was sitting in water, his legs crossed, 5 kunai in the tip of the fingers of his right hand. A leaf on his forehead. Kurama was giving him a bit of his chakra, which made it harder to control his chakra. Controlling both his and Kurama's chakra was more challenging, but Furball stated he needed to get used to his chakra before he moved to 1 tail worth of chakra and more tails. Fukasaku was close, and keeping an eye on the young boy, he could feel the Kyuubi's chakra leaking from Naruto. He was still impressed to see that the Kyuubi would ever be a friend with anyone. But still, he was happy for it, and Naruto would need his help against Akatsuki. Naruto's eyes were red, and looking at Fukasaku, who had a cane in his right hand, staring at him. Naruto kept focused and tried not to make mistakes in his training. Toji promised to start training him on elemental manipulation once he can do chakra control exercises while using Kurama's chakra. So far, so good, and Naruto couldn't wait to start elemental manipulation. The other jutsu he knew was 1 fire jutsu, 2 water jutsu, and 1 wind. He still didn't know any earth jutsu. Fire style, fireball. Water style, bullet point. Water style, shockwave. Wind style, great breakthrough. When it came to Fuinjutsu, he was in level 4, and it took him 7 months to pass level 3. To pass level 4, Naruto needed to write a trap seal, chakra flowing seal, and weight seals. He was sure he was close to completing a chakra flowing seal. That seal could be used to block someone's chakra flow and storage chakra to use later. Naruto had noticed that his Toji had avoided talking about the village, sometimes just trying to change the subject. Naruto had asked how Gigi was and how the village was in general. Naruto didn't care that, but he still asked, but every time he asked that, Naruto could feel the feeling of fury coming from Toji. Naruto didn't know why and didn't try to force him to answer. Hokage Gigi had sent a few letters asking him how he was and if he enjoyed it there. Naruto, of course, said, yes, since here no one looked at him with hatred, he didn't need to watch around every corner when he was outside. Naruto felt free in Mount Myoboku, and having no one to call you demon was a relief. You're done now, Naruto. He looked at Fukasaku, who made a gesture for him to stand up. Naruto nodded and stood up on his legs. He was wearing a dark shirt with the symbol of fire on the chest, a tight red jacket reached his waist. His mother's sword tightened behind his back. Naruto was still young to use it, but he wanted to have it around. Fukasaku had told him he could teach him a few things about kenjutsu but not much. Naruto had a few books about kenjutsu, but it wasn't the same as having an experienced teacher to teach you. Tojiji said he could start training on kenjutsu once he starts the academy. He wanted Naruto to complete or at least get close to completing his chakra manipulation for his affinities for the last 2 years he had left here. And if possible, be able to use 1 tael worth of chakra. Even Kurama had agreed to that. Now that you're done with that, we can start with a spar, Fukasaku-sama suggested. Naruto smiled at that since it had been a few months since he had wanted to start training for real. Follow me, he said, and Naruto followed behind, looking around. His mind went to what Kurama had told him about the other bijou in the world. Naruto had been curious about the other bijou and wondered how they were and what kind of character they had. Naruto was back at his mindscape. It had been 3 months since he arrived in Mount Myaboku. The forest was back how it was before. Kurama was lying on the grass behind the cage. He looked to be sleeping, but one of his eyes was slightly opened, looking at Naruto's form walking towards him. Naruto frowned every time he saw the damn cage. He had asked Kurama if he could open the seal, but he told him that even if he could, he wasn't ready yet. Kurama, one thing I have been wondering, you said your brothers and sisters were captured by the first Hokage. Who are they? And where are they? Naruto asked curiously with his hands behind his head. He knew that there were 9 bijou out there, but he wanted to learn more about them. Kurama raised his eyebrows slightly but felt slightly happy that Naruto wanted to know about them. As you know, there are 9 of us. Shikaku, One-Tail Raccoon, my youngest brother. He always liked to fight and always a bit cocky, hell almost as much as me. His abilities are to control sand. Matatabi the Two-Tails cat, she wasn't really into fighting. Her abilities were to be able to use blue flames. They're 5 times hotter than normal flames, but Matatabi, well, she is. How can I say this? Kurama didn't really know how to say that to a little kid. I will tell you later. Next is Isabo, the 3-tails turtle. He was always calm and quiet one and always liked water. After all, his techniques are water jutsus. Son Goku, the 4-tails monkey. Naruto raised his eyebrow at the name. He could have sworn he had heard that name before. Naruto shrugged his shoulders and decided to listen to Kurama. Son is wise but irritating. His ability is lava release. Then is Kokuo, the 5-tails horse. He is more like a free spirit. He doesn't like when someone tries to tell him what to do and likes to run. And easy to make friends with. His ability is boil release. Then is Saiken, the 6-tails slug. He's quiet and cooperative and always likes to find a non-combat way to fix problems. His ability is to use acid that can melt everything. If you ever meet his Jinchuriki, be careful. He's top 4 bijou and should not be taken lightly, Kurama warned, and Naruto nodded and knew Kurama wouldn't call just anyone dangerous. Then is Komiyai, the 7-tails beetle. She's a positive one. She always called herself Lucky 7 or other annoying names like that. She was friendly and always liked to talk and crack jokes. She can fly and use insects. Then is Gyuki, the 8-tails octopus. Last time I checked, he didn't really get along with humans, but it has been hundreds of years since we talked. His head is strong as a rock but can crack jokes here and there. Can use ink release and his horns can be dangerous. Kurama finished, then stood in all his 4 with his 9 tails showing behind him like mountains, and finally me. Kurama, the 9-tails demon fox, the strongest, he stated with a smirk. Naruto chuckled at his words and smiled at him. Kurama then remembered one more that he didn't mention, but Naruto didn't need to know about him. Naruto noticed his feelings but decided not to ask why. He was feeling a bit of fury but fear at the same time. Thank you for telling me, Kurama. I hope you can meet again with your siblings, Naruto said, and himself hoping he could meet someone like him. You're welcome. One more question. Bijous are very strong, but the animals and summoning contracts are strong as well. Is there any summoning that is stronger than any of the bijou? Naruto asked curiously since he was living with the toads and wondered how strong they could be. Kurama rested his head on his paws and looked directly at Naruto. There was one. Your clan actually possessed that summoning contract long ago but was lost when Yuzu was destroyed, Kurama stated with melancholy in his tone. Naruto was surprised by his tone and walked closer. Which one was it? Naruto asked since the summoning contract belonged to his clan. Kurama turned his eyes to Naruto. Phoenix Contract, and the head of Phoenix Contract. Haiwa, Peace, was the strongest animal that wasn't a bijou. She was stronger than Sun, 4 tails, but weaker than Kokuo, 5 tails, but mostly dependent on where you fought her. I fought her once, and gave me a very good hit that I still remember, said with a slight chuckle at the end. Naruto smiled and wondered where the contract was and if he could ever find it. Naruto escaped his thoughts when he felt something touching his legs. He looked down to see Fukasaku-sama staring at him, talking to him again. He asked, already used to Naruto's zoomed-out habits whenever he talked with the Kyuubi. No, just was remembering something, Naruto replied, slightly embarrassed and wondering where other bijou were and where the Jinchurikis were and if they lived like him or maybe even worse. Oh well, time to train, he stated and moved further back from Naruto. He understood it and moved his hands and legs in a position to fight. I will win Databayo, Naruto said, smiling at Fukasaku. Naruto moved first with his fist aiming at the toad, and he quickly jumped much faster than Naruto predicted and hit him in the head with his cane. He quickly moved away and narrowed his eyes. He always knew Fukasaku was stronger than he let on, but now he understood he was much stronger. Very well, Naruto whispered and moved faster than before, caughting Fukasaku by surprise, who jumped to avoid his fist, but Naruto jumped as well and moved his right leg towards his body. He used his cane to block it when a second leg came from his right. He dodged it quickly, landed on the ground, and rushed towards Naruto faster than before. Later. After hours of training, Naruto was panting. His fists had marks and bleeding a little, a few bruises on his face and stomach. His weights are still on his body. Despite the pain, he refused to stop. Fukasaku looked at him with interest, wondering if Naruto would call it a day or not. Then Naruto did a hand seal when blue chakra started flowing through his body. He smirked and rushed at the toad twice the speed. Fukasaku was surprised and tried to dodge when Naruto raised his fist above him. In the last second, Fukasaku moved away, but when Naruto's fist touched the ground split, causing a crater to appear. The dirt moved around the air, little rocks fell in the ground, and Fukasaku was sure he must have seen it wrong. The crater was as large as Naruto. He stood there panting, standing in all his four, his knees touching the ground. His face was full of dirt. Fukasaku moved closer when Naruto lost consciousness and fell to the ground tired. What was that? That was quite a fist. Fukasaku thought and moved closer to the sleeping Naruto. He usually was quiet, but now Naruto was snoring. The old toad smiled and decided to put him back in his bed. He needed to rest, and Jiraiya needed to know about this. Chapter 18, Senju Blood. Hokage Tower. The pile of papers in front of him was growing like trees, but the old Hokage couldn't bring himself even to move a finger. Smoking on his pipe, his gaze returned to look outside the window, to look at the village that he had fought for and protected for so many years. The wounds he took, how many friends he had seen die, and how Tobirama-sensei and Hashirama-sama talked about the will of fire. The Hidden Leaf Village, a place no child will ever be harmed, and they can grow with their families and not be sent to wars. But now Hiruzen wasn't sure what he was looking for anymore. The village people had changed, or maybe they were always like that, and he just didn't see it. Hiruzen wasn't sure anymore. So many things looked different. Jiraiya had been furious when it had happened. And for some time, Sarutobi was sure that his student would abandon the village, just like Orochimaru, and Tsunade, who still felt grief over her losses. Jiraiya had stated that he would return Naruto when he thought that he was ready, if ever. Sarutobi couldn't blame him. Naruto was only a kid. It had been 2 years since Jiraiya had left with Naruto to train in Mount Myaboku. Hiruzen was sure he had made the right decision. His surrogate grandson needed peace. Sarutobi knew if they kept treating Naruto like that, it would be only a matter of time before Naruto betrays the village, or even worse, do something utterly reckless like freeing the Kyuubi. He knew Naruto was on good terms with him. However, Sarutobi still didn't fully trust the demon fox. The old Hokage knew if Naruto didn't feel any attachment with the village, he would leave to find another place to call home. His mind went to Uzushiogakure. Jiraiya had sent letters that Naruto was a prodigy in Fuinjutsu and ninjutsu in general. That warmed Sarutobi's heart. Naruto was just like his father, he learned quickly. Take it around 10 more years, and he was sure Naruto would be a new Fuinjutsu master. Just like Jiraiya, and by the time he reached his 20s, he would be just as good as Fuinjutsu masters of Uzushiogakure. A week after Naruto had left, he had earned a visit from his old teammate. Working behind a pile of paper was the old Hokage, who at this point wanted just to rest and read his favorite book and relax for a little bit, after an hour of trying to fight the urge just to burn the evil spawn. Signing the last paper, he sighed in relief, but as if the god himself was against him. The door suddenly opened, revealing his old friend walking with a cane. Sarutobi narrowed his eyes. He didn't know why he was here. But whatever the reason, it wasn't a good one. Sarutobi never truly understood why Danzo needed the cane. They are old, but at the same time, proud shinobi, and walking around with a cane wasn't something he thought Danzo would like. His face showed irritation. Sarutobi knew Danzo was good at hiding his emotions, but he could see behind his emotionless mask. Danzo walked into the center of the office, and his gaze was at the old Hokage. Hiruzen just brushed his gaze off like a fly and decided just to be blunt and not waste time dancing around the bush. "What do you want, Danzo?" "I know very well you're not here to talk about the old times," Hiruzen asked, his eyes narrowed, piercing Danzo's soul like a sword. "I want to know where the weapon is," he asked with an emotionless tone. Hiruzen stood up, his hands slammed on the desk and leaking his ki, making even his own Anbu sweat and shake slightly. "Listen to me, Danzo, his name is Naruto and he's not a weapon," Hiruzen stated with a firm tone, promising pain to his old teammate. Danzo clenched his hand around his cane, his eye narrowed. He always hated to be talked like that by Hiruzen. "Is that so?" "That's rich when you remember that his own father made him a weapon," Danzo stated with a slight smirk that caused Hiruzen to leak ki that made the desk in front of him crack. The floor close to his feet cracked slightly. Danzo felt sweat on his forehead. "I would be careful if I were you. Many people suddenly die of old age, a heart attack, blood pressure, many things can suddenly happen," Hiruzen stated with a tone that made the message clear to Danzo. His old teammate cleared his throat and washed away the sweat with his forearm. Taking a deep breath. "Where's Naruto then?" he asked slowly and quietly. Hiruzen sat down, picked his pipe, and smoked from it. Danzo stood there waiting for his answer. After a minute, Sarutobi pulled away from his pipe and spread his hands in front of his desk. "That information is classified. I know where he is and that's what's important, and you better remember that you're talking to your Hokage and you can't demand anything from me." "If I wanted to, I can tell Naruto to never return here," Hokage replied quietly and calmly, his voice so low, almost like a whisper. Danzo heard him and gritted his teeth, but he suddenly smirked. Danzo stood up and looked down at the old Hokage. "I noticed that some trees have started growing in unusual places around the village. Especially one a week ago," he said, which made the old Hokage narrow his eyes, and a shadow covered his eyes. The air in the room suddenly felt cold, almost freezing. Danzo felt a shiver on his entire body, but he kept his confidence. The Anbu in the office were confused about what the old hawk was talking about, except one of them wondered how a kid could do that. "Leave," he ordered, and Danzo left without saying another word. Sarutobi felt a headache. He really wished that Minato was still around. He was getting older to deal with the problems of the village. With Minato around, Naruto would be safe, and he wouldn't have to deal with Danzo's shit. Remembering that made him feel another headache, but the problem with Danzo was only the tip of the iceberg. A month after Naruto had left, the word had spread that Naruto was dead, and around the village, the villagers and some shinobi had started celebrating. When that had happened, Sarutobi felt terrible. The village he was protecting was celebrating what they thought was the death of a child. The very same day, Shikaku had burst into his office. Looking pissed, Sarutobi couldn't remember the last time he had seen him so angry. The old Hokage quickly told him that Naruto was safe and training outside the village. Shikaku had sighed in relief but was still mad with what the village was doing. Then Kakashi came to his office asking where Naruto was. He returned 11 days after Naruto left the village. Sarutobi was reading his favorite book when he heard a knock on the door. "Come in," Sarutobi ordered, and the door opened to reveal Kakashi, who, despite his mask, looked worried. "What can I do for you, Kakashi?" Sarutobi asked, already knowing what he wanted from him. "Hokage-sama. I checked Naruto's home and didn't find him anywhere. I checked the training yard but he's nowhere to be seen," he stated with a worried tone. His tone was slightly higher than usual. His hands were fists. His breathing was heavy, and his right eye widened somewhat. Sarutobi raised his hand as a sign to calm down. "Don't worry, Naruto is safe, he's outside the village. Jiraiya is with him, you don't have to worry about him." Kakashi sighed in relief but then looked up at the Hokage in confusion. Why? He asked, knowing there must be a reason for Jiraiya-sama to take Naruto away from the village. Sarutobi pinched the bridge on his nose. He was beaten by the villagers, and Jiraiya-sama took him away to train, he stated. And noticed Kakashi clenched his fist, his body moving slightly around and leaking a small amount of ki. Kakashi was about to ask, no demand where are the idiots who did this, but Sarutobi beat him to it. They're dead, Kakashi, and believe it or not. Naruto was the one who killed them, Sarutobi said, but at the same time feeling bad for his surrogate grandson, he was only a child still. And being forced to grow up before his time. Never knowing what childhood is like. On the other hand, Kakashi felt a sense of pride and dread for his student, he was firm but killing at such a young age. Hell, even he didn't kill until he became a genin when he was 5 years old. Silence took over the office. Kakashi felt his throat dry, and he finally found his voice to speak. How? Kakashi asked quietly. Sarutobi then explained to him what happened, but not including the part where he could use Mokuton. Instead, he told him that the Kyuubi had helped him. It was January when it happened, and some had said to make it a celebration day for the demon's death. Sarutobi had quickly declined the offer, and those that had suggested sent to Ibiki. Now, the academy had started. He knew Naruto would have started the academy's first year last month if he was still here. Of course, the civil council was happy and said that their children were safe now to go to the academy without Naruto around. Things for the village hadn't gone well. For so many years, Hiruzen had tried to maintain peace, hoping that he could somehow bring peace for the 5 shinobi villages. Last year Kumo had said that they wanted peace between villages. He felt it as a right step to peace. Sarutobi was happy for it, the hostility between them would end, but all that had gone downhill. Kumo had tried to kidnap Hinata Hyuga, resulting in Hyuga Hisashi's death to keep the peace. Things between Kumo and Konoha were hostile right now. Konoha's only alliance was with Suna, but partnerships between villages weren't known to last long. One minute he's drinking with you, the next he stabs you in the back. The only alliance that they ever had that actually meant anything was with Uzushiogakure. The strongest Fuinjutsu users to ever exist, they valued strength and honor but most importantly, family. Thinking about his old allies, he remembered Jiraiya mentioning that Naruto had said that he would want to visit the ancient ruins of his homeland, as Naruto called it. It hurts to Hiruzen knowing that Naruto didn't see Leaf Village as his homeland. But the old Hokage couldn't really blame him. Hiruzen, of course, was impressed with how quickly Naruto learned. He knew when Naruto would arrive, he would be far stronger than any student in the academy. Right now, he needed to worry about the Uchiha clan, they were becoming more hostile every day. Itachi had given him valuable information. Fugaku Uchiha was in the center of all of it, he didn't know yet if they would try a coup d'état to overthrow the village. Sighing, he returned to his paperwork and hoped everything would be fine. Naruto. Panting, he felt tired. His legs were shaking like a leaf, sweat rolling down his face and falling to the ground. His hands on his knees. The sun wasn't making it any easier to train. The heat was all around the air, making the air itself feel hot. It has been 3 months since his spar with Fukasaku, and they had leveled up his training. Now he needed to run 300 times around Mount Myaboku. With 70 pounds on his legs and 50 on his arms. Climb up 100 meters with the same weight and not use chakra. Naruto couldn't complain, he wanted to get stronger to rebuild his homeland when the time came, and he wouldn't get stronger by sitting around and being lazy. Taking a deep breath, filling his lungs with fresh air. He felt relaxed and continued his morning run. He reached his 319 runs but wanted 350 runs around the mountain. Naruto always did that. Every morning, when he was doing 200 runs, he would do 250 instead. As he kept running and running and running, and still running. Kurama inside was watching with amusement but not helping in any way. Naruto had told him to not help him in running exercise. Or at any kind of exercise that wasn't required his help. He wanted to do it on his own. Kurama only helped when Naruto lost consciousness or was hurt during a spar or when seals blew upon his face. After running for 1 more hour, Naruto finished his last run around the mountain and fell on his knees, panting. Sweat was everywhere around his body, even his clothes looked slightly transparent. He was lying on the ground, trying to rest. The seal on his stomach started glowing red. Naruto felt himself recovering a little faster, He could feel the weird feeling on his stomach and still didn't understand why. Kurama seemed to have no answers, and neither did Tojiji, who had seen the seal glowing red. But he just said that as long as the seal did him no harm, it was probably fine. And so far, it had helped Naruto. Naruto suddenly saw Fukasaku in front of him with a skin bottle. He grabbed it and started drinking water. Easy, not so fast, Fukasaku said, and Naruto slowed his drinking. After a minute, he felt relieved and followed Fukasaku back to his home. Jiraiya boy will arrive today. He will start your elemental training, the old toad stated, and Naruto was happy to hear that. As soon as he finished his elemental training, he could start practicing one of the jutsus that his Ka-chan had left for him. He knew all of them were dangerous, but he hoped he could do fire style, Phoenix. That one seemed the least harmful, and he was sure he could do it with his high fire affinity. Kurama, you said my people had the Phoenix contract, do you think someone could have stolen it when they destroyed it? Naruto asked with a hint of anger in his tone. I don't think anyone did. I'm sure no one can enter the most valuable places of the Uzushiogakure. They knew how to secure their good jutsus and secrets, and not to mention that the Phoenix contract won't accept anyone else but an Uzumaki to use it. Uzumaki clan made sure of that, Kurama replied with a touch of melancholy on his tone. Naruto felt a relief. The thought that someone who wasn't an Uzumaki would use the Phoenix contract angered him. Especially someone who had stolen it. Reaching the house, he saw his Tojiji standing in front of the house with a smile. Naruto already knew he was here but still smiled and ran at him and gave him a big hug. Jiraiya hugged him back and rubbed his red hair, which had reached his shoulders. How are you, Naruto? I hope you're training well, Jiraiya asked, taking a step back and giving his godson a good look. He seemed to have grown, and most importantly, his sadness and weariness on his face seemed to have disappeared, and instead, his face was full of light, almost like a sun shining on him. He was wearing a red jacket, a white shirt underneath. Black pants with black shinobi sandals. Yes. I'm running around the mountain like crazy, I will soon reach your level. Dadabayo, he stated with a fist on the air. Jiraiya smiled and reached a scroll from his pocket and tossed it to Naruto, who grabbed it in his hands. Confusion filled his face, but he opened the scroll to see what it was all about. Opening the scroll, he read the name of the jutsu. B rank, Shadow Clone Jutsu, he read, and a smile spread from ear to ear. You're gonna teach me the famous clone jutsu of the second Hokage, Naruto said, to be met with a shook of Jiraiya's head. No. You will learn it without my help, let's see how fast you can learn it, Jiraiya stated, looking down at Naruto, who looked surprised for a second but immediately nodded his head and ran away somewhere to learn the jutsu alone without any interruption. Jiraiya saw his grandson leave, and he wondered if he would be able to understand the secret of the Shadow Clone Jutsu. If he didn't, he wouldn't tell him until Naruto learned it himself. Naruto ran deep into the nearby forest and opened the scroll. The place was quiet. The wind brushed his hair. Naruto felt the warm breeze against his face. The grass beneath his legs caressed his skin. He started reading and wanting to learn as fast as possible, but at the same time, Naruto was slightly confused. He knew he needed to see a clone jutsu. But he thought his Tojiji would help him in elemental training and couldn't understand what Shadow Clone had to do with it. He shrugged his shoulders slightly and decided to turn back to reading the scroll. After 1 hour, Jiraiya was drinking tea with Fukasaku and Ma. They seated around a round table. The tea tasted sweet like any other time before. Will you find her soon? Fukasaku asked, taking a sip from the tea. Jiraiya nodded his head. I'm sure. Once I find Tsunade, I will tell her to come here and see Naruto. I'm sure the first Hokage necklace that she has will react to Naruto, Jiraiya replied and thought about his old teammate. He knew she had suffered, everyone had suffered, but at the same time, he wondered why she wouldn't stay to take care of Naruto. She was always close with Kushina. He knew there was something more there other than just not caring about her godson. And Tsunade wasn't someone to just not care about him. Glancing outside the window, he saw the sun was high in the sky. It must be around 11:00. He wondered how long it would take for Naruto to do Shadow Clone Jutsu. At the same time, he couldn't stop thinking about what Fukasaku had told him 3 months ago. According to him, Naruto was able to create a small crater with just his fist alone. Fukasaku had tested Naruto again, same results. His fists were quite strong, just like Tsunade. Jiraiya thought, and before he could think more about it, he heard a shout outside the house. Shadow Clone Jutsu Naruto shouted outside. Jiraiya immediately burst the door open to see around 30 Narutos jumping around with their fists in the air. What he assumed was the real Naruto walked in the front with a beaming smile. He raised his fist in the air. "I did it, Databeo!" all Naruto shouted together at the same time. Jiraiya smiled proudly, and so did Fukasaku and Ma, who looked impressed that he could do it so fast. "Naruto," Jiraiya shouted, grabbing his attention and walking closer to him. "Now that you have done it, let's start with a spar," he suggested, cracking knuckles. Naruto jumped and nodded immediately. "Good, and use everything you have." "No holding back in any way," Jiraiya stated thoughtfully. Naruto understood. The clones disappeared, leaving only him and his Tojiji. Ma and Fukasaku moved away to give them space. Naruto cracked his knuckles and moved his legs around. Jiraiya noticed that he didn't remove his weights but decided to bring Naruto to his limit. Secretly he hoped to force Naruto to use Kyuubi's chakra. He knew Uzumaki blood would make it easier to control it. "Kid, fight me intending to kill me," Jiraiya stated. Naruto's eyes widened slightly but turned to normal again. Without saying another word, Naruto rushed at Jiraiya with all his speed. His speed was quickly Genin speed, but Jiraiya knew he still had his weight on. Naruto threw a punch at him but quickly grabbed him. Jiraiya noticed the power behind the punch. Naruto punched, again and again, trying to find an opening. Jiraiya saw his moves. He was using the same style with his Toad fighting style but was slightly changed. Naruto jumped high in the air and made a few hand seals. "Fire style, fireball," he shouted, and a giant fireball moved towards him. Jiraiya backed away, but Naruto was behind him. He hit Jiraiya in the back. He immediately backed away from Naruto. The strength behind his fists was outstanding. Jiraiya knew Naruto was stronger than he was at his age. Naruto moved again, but his right hand was glowing in chakra. Jiraiya smirked and, in purpose, blocked the fist with his palm. That made the ground beneath shake slightly from the strength. Jiraiya grabbed his whole arm and threw him to the ground, only for him to poof. Before Jiraiya could look to see where Naruto was, a fireball headed towards him. Jiraiya did a few hand seals. Water style, massive water came out, a massive amount of water from his mouth that vaporized the fireball. The field was covered in steam. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes, but then he heard a shout. With style, ground spikes immediately grew from the ground, making Jiraiya jump high in the air to avoid it, but then Naruto jumped in front of him with his unsheathed sword, slicing his chest only for Jiraiya to turn into a log. Naruto landed, and Jiraiya was in front of him and punched him in the gut. Still, Naruto turned to smoke, much to Jiraiya's surprise, who immediately turned around to block a fist from Naruto. Jiraiya knew about Naruto's sensing skills, so he decided to be a bit harsher. Grabbing his hand, he used his knee on his stomach, leaving Naruto breathless but still jumping away. "Is that all you got?" "I'm disappointed," Jiraiya stated, but Naruto could feel he was lying but still felt hurt by his words. He made a hand seal, and his weight seals turned off. Jiraiya smirked. Naruto rushed again, but this time with medium Chunin speed. Throwing punch after punch, Jiraiya blocked all of them but noticed that Naruto valued his speed more than his strength. Naruto unsheathed his sword and swung at his head, but Jiraiya grabbed it with two of his fingers, punching Naruto in the stomach and again on the face and again on the chest and throwing him against a wall. Naruto felt pain all over him. He knew his Tojiji was strong but much stronger than he expected. He then noticed that his mother's katana wasn't in his hands. He saw that his sensei was holding on to his hands. Naruto gritted his teeth. That sword belonged to his mother. "You want it? Come and grab it." Naruto made another sign, and his whole body was filled with chakra. "A storage chakra seal," Jiraiya murmured, impressed by his student. Naruto grabbed a kunai and threw it at Jiraiya, who quickly dodged it but felt a small cut on his cheek. Naruto's whole right arm was covered in chakra and was in front of Jiraiya with high Chunin speed. Jiraiya moved away, and Naruto's fist hit the ground, causing a massive crack on the ground. The ground split, causing small rocks to fall in the ground. Breathing heavily, Naruto felt a sharp metal against his neck. "You lost control," Jiraiya stated, but then he felt a sharp pain in his leg. He turned to see another Naruto with a kunai. Jiraiya smirked and poofed out of existence. Naruto quickly grabbed his sword and turned to the real Jiraiya walking towards him. "When did you create that clone?" Jiraiya asked, not knowing. When I first used my fireball jutsu, Naruto replied at him. Naruto, of course, knew he wasn't fighting the real Tojiji, but he knew if he couldn't defeat a simple clone, then it was pointless to fight the real one. Jiraiya understood what Naruto had done. At first, he thought he had created only one clone, but he had created a second that hid in the forest. Then he had acted like he lost control to leave an opening for the clone. Jiraiya smiled proudly. At first, he was annoyed that Naruto would lose control so easily, but it seemed that wasn't the case. But then his face turned deadly serious. Very well, time to test your full power, Jiraiya stated, and immediately was in front of Naruto and slammed a seal on his forehead and backed away. Naruto suddenly felt Kurama's chakra filling him. His eyes turned red, his whiskers grew. His red hair looked even redder. A red cloak suddenly showed around Naruto. He slowly stood on his four, and a tail slowly raised behind his back. His nails grew. Jiraiya smiled and was ready for the attack. Chapter 19, Elemental Manipulation. Fukasaku looked at Naruto's form worriedly. He could feel Kurama's chakra spreading around like wildfire. The wind got harsher, grass near Naruto flew away, and some burned in the air and turned to ash. Naruto's chakra cloak was red. The part around his head had two large ears like a fox. His teeth had grown, and his eyes looked red like blood. His red hair looked spikier. One tail slowly grew behind his back, indicating that he was using one tail worth of chakra. Fukasaku didn't like this. He knew Naruto was good, and the Uzumaki blood helped him to control the chakra easier, but still. Jiraiya boy? Are you sure about this? Ma suddenly asked beside him. Her voice was full of concern, her eyes glancing both Jiraiya and Naruto. Don't worry, I believe in Naruto, and even if he does lose control, I won't let him do anything, Jiraiya replied, keeping his eyes only at Naruto and ready at a fighting stance. Ma and Fukasaku kept quiet and watched the young boy still not moving or doing anything against them. Naruto felt the surge of power. He couldn't believe Kurama had so much chakra. It was overwhelming. But Naruto felt something. It felt like bad intentions. He wasn't sure. Gritting his teeth tightly, he tried to calm himself, but then he saw visions of himself getting beaten, the words, the insults, to him and his parents. All repeated on his head, voices on his head, telling him he was a demon. Naruto, calm down. Don't think about that. Kurama's voice was suddenly heard. The fox knew the darkness inside Naruto was slowly coming out. Naruto heard him and tried to think of the good times of his life, but they were few: his time with Tojiji, Hokage-jiji, his friends in the village, and the toads of Mount Myaboku. Naruto's breath got heavier, and he suddenly saw himself lying in a pile of blood. The villagers were mocking him and not stopping. Naruto left a roar that made trees tear from the ground under him slightly blackened, almost as if fire had burned it. Jiraiya saw Naruto was losing control. He was about to move when Naruto moved right in front of him with his right palm. Jiraiya saw the attack and dodged quickly, causing the ground where Naruto hit to crack slightly. But Naruto moved fast again and tried to punch him, his fist covered in red chakra. It was making his attacks much stronger. Jiraiya knew Naruto could feel everyone around and decided to end this when the seal in his stomach started glowing red like fire. Naruto suddenly stopped moving. The spiral in his seal started growing and going in the center of his seal. Jiraiya saw Naruto's face change from fury to shock. He stopped moving and just stood on his four, gritting his teeth. His right hand moved to his stomach, then Naruto grabbed his head and started screaming in agony. His chakra cloak slowly disappeared and moved to the seal until his chakra cloak was gone. Jiraiya couldn't understand what had just happened. Naruto's red eyes turned blue again, and he fell to the ground unconscious. Jiraiya sighed sadly. His godson was only 6 years old and not ready yet. He was taking a deep breath. He took Naruto in his arms and returned him to his bed. Looking down at Naruto, Jiraiya moved away from his hair that covered his right eye and turned to go outside. Opening the door, he was met with glares from both Fukasaku and Ma. He sighed sadly and lowered his head, and sat on the ground near the house, his upper body resting against the wall of the house. His gaze turned to Fukasaku. Look. I understand Naruto will need to be able to use that chakra, not only against Akatsuki but against life itself. Naruto has many bad memories, more bad ones than good ones. Try next time. After 2 years, Fukasaku suggested, knowing that Jiraiya boy wanted Naruto to be ready when the time came. He was the only family he had left. He couldn't handle losing Naruto as well. Jiraiya just nodded his head, his gaze turned downwards. He hoped Naruto wouldn't hate for forcing Kurama's chakra out. Looking down at his hands, he wondered what Minato would do if he were here. Would he be alright with training so hard when he's still so young, or would he wait for Naruto to have a childhood, a good one, with friends and a loving family? Jiraiya knew normal childhood was gone the moment he sealed Kyuubi or Kurama inside Naruto. Sometimes, he wished he could have been there. He should have been the one protecting his student. A teacher was supposed to protect their student and not the other way around. He stood up slowly and walked inside the house, Naruto sleeping quietly on his bed. His right hand out of the sheet, his long red hair was reaching his shoulders. He looked so calm and happy like that, Jiraiya thought. He walked up to him and covered his right arm, slowly not wanting to wake him up. Leaving the house, thought was on Jiraiya's mind. Naruto. What is your dream for the future? What makes you get up from bed every morning and train? Is it recognizing? Or something else? Jiraiya asked himself, but he had a few thoughts about what Naruto wanted, and he knew that Naruto had every right to want that. Naruto. In front of him was Kurama, who was lying on the floor close to the bars. The trees and grass were still inside his mindscape. Naruto looked down in shame inside the cage alongside Kurama, who stared at him with worry. I lost control, Naruto said quietly, almost like a whisper. He had tried so hard to control his negative emotions. But the voices and visions of himself lying in the ground just didn't stop. He tried to think of better things, like his Tojiji and the old Hokage, but it wasn't enough. Don't beat yourself, kid, you tried, that's what's important. Don't cry if you tried your hardest, that is an insult to your determination, Kurama replied, feeling Naruto resting his head against his neck. Thank you, Kurama, you really are my best friend. Naruto stated happily that he had someone like Kurama all the time with him. Of course, he knew Kurama was imprisoned inside him and probably wanted more to be out there, in the real nature. Naruto, since you don't have that many good memories then. Kurama suddenly moved, and Naruto turned to see him with a closed fist close to him. Naruto didn't understand what Kurama was trying to do with that. He looked up at him, confused, and raised an eyebrow. Trust me, Kurama reassured him. Naruto nodded his head and bumped his fist against his, and suddenly he saw a vision. Naruto suddenly saw a woman with long red hair that reached her waist. She was beautiful. She was holding her hand against her stomach, walking towards a door. It was night outside, the light close to the door showing her face. Naruto could swear he had seen her before somewhere. Opening it, and Naruto saw his father standing on the other side of the room with a bowl in his hands. I just did my test today. I'm going to be a mother databane, she almost shouted, her smile not leaving her face. Her face looked to be shining from happiness. Naruto felt joy fill him. A smile slowly appeared on his face. I'm going to be a father, his father replied, as shocked as the woman. I'm going to be a mother, his mother said again, walking closer. I'm going to be a father, he shouted and hugged her with love. His eyes were smiling just as much as his face, her head rested against his shoulder. Tears of joy rolled down her cheek. Seeing that, Naruto felt tears rolling down his cheek. His heart filled with happiness. Another vision came. He saw his Tuchan and Ka-chan, his Tuchan's face against her belly, listening for any movement. His Ka-chan rubbed her hand through his golden hair. His father looked happy, his eyes closed. Did you hear that? His father suddenly asked, moving his head away slightly and looking up at her. She smiled and nodded her head. I heard it. He will be strong and gentle just like you and me, she whispered and wrapped her hands around his head and kissed his lips. The vision changed again. Naruto saw his mother waiting against a wall, voices on the other side of the room. You know, I would want my son to be just like the character of this book. You choose his name after all, Naruto heard his father say. Ah, it was just a name I came up with while eating, he heard a very familiar voice. His mother moved and stood beside his father, her hand resting against his shoulder and the other on her stomach. Naruto smiled, seeing Tojiji, who had a shocked face. Naruto is a wonderful name, her mother started rubbing her belly. Kushina, hahaha, does that make me his godfather or something? He asked nervously, his hand rubbing his hair. His mother nodded happily. So is Tsunade, she was happy to hear that, his mother stated, smiling brightly. Suddenly the vision stopped, and Naruto was back at his mindscape, Kurama looking down at him. Naruto couldn't help but smile, using his forearm to wash away the tears on his cheek. He looked up at Kurama. Thank you, he said, and Kurama noticed the trees growing larger, the lake looked brighter. The grass felt real. Is nothing, Kurama replied, resting his head on his paws. Looking at him again, Naruto could feel regret and sadness coming from Kurama but decided to not ask about it. Naruto slowly opened his eyes. First, his vision was blurry, but he noticed Tojiji sleeping. His head was resting against the wall, his legs spread around, and his arms behind his head. Naruto smiled and slowly walked to him. Slowly touching his cheek was enough to open his eyes slowly. At first, his eyes showed confusion, but then immediately filled with regret. He was about to open his mouth and talk when Naruto placed a finger on his lips. I'm not angry at you, Gigi. So don't feel bad. Naruto started smiling. Jiraiya smiled back and brought him in a big hug, and began rubbing his red hair. Thank you, Naruto, he said quietly. Pulling away, they soon were joined by Fukasaku and Ma, who asked if Naruto was alright. The redhead quickly nodded and ate with them. It wasn't the most delicious dish but still far better than eating insects, just the thought of it made him want to vomit. Walking outside, Jiraiya stood in front of Naruto with a leaf in his hand. Naruto, today we will start your elemental manipulation training, but before we do that, I need to ask if you noticed anything about the shadow clone jutsu. His Tojiji asked seriously. Naruto raised an eyebrow, rubbing his hand behind his head, and now that he thought about it, he remembered that he had the memories of his clones. Understanding what he meant, Naruto quickly nodded his head. Yes, I remember having the memories of my clones, Naruto replied, and thinking that it was so easy to notice, only an idiot wouldn't notice it. Jiraiya grinned and nodded his head in confirmation, and gave him a leaf. Now what you need to do is cut that leaf for wind element, gather water from the leaf for water, burn to ash for fire and turn to dirt for the earth. Using your hands. Naruto nodded and already had an idea what he could do with shadow clone jutsu. He understood why Tojiji taught him that. Before anyone could say anything, he crossed his fingers, and suddenly 400 clones appeared all around. Alright, listen to me. 100 grab a leaf and try to burn it with your hands, 100 try to gather water from the leaf, 100 try to turn it to dirt, and 100 slice it, Naruto ordered, and all his clones started working. Naruto himself started working on gathering water from the leaf. He wanted to be better in wood style, and knowing more about water style and earth style was a good step. Jiraiya watched with amusement and decided to see how he would do it. The following day Naruto woke, took a bath in the lake, stretched, and started doing his physical workout. After doing his physical exercise, Naruto began to run around the Mount Myaboku for his speed training after Tojiji increased the weights to 100 pounds in legs and 70 in arms. After the speed training, Naruto began his taijutsu training with Jiraiya. Jiraiya created a clone so that Naruto could spar with after he taught him an advancement style of Toad style. Jiraiya sensei was the teacher who explained the katas of the Toad style to the boy, and the clone was used as a sparring partner to allow Naruto to learn the motions of the style. Naruto worked on this program the entire morning and was glad when it finally got dark so he could get some lunch before going back to practice again. He sat down with his aching legs. Man, I did not know my legs could hurt so much after all the training that I have been through, Naruto said to himself. He still hasn't made any progress in elemental manipulation, but Tojiji told him to have patience. It takes years of training for most shinobi to complete elemental manipulation training. Naruto understood and decided to be patient and just train every day. He didn't want to be a weakling. He knew the village would hate him once he returned, but he wouldn't allow him to be pushed around like he was their toy. Hidden Stone Village. Two men headed for the gates of IWA. One was an older man, though with solid red hair on his head and beard. He wore a long-sleeved purple shirt and pants, with a mesh armor shirt underneath and brown armor atop it. He had a bag tied around his waist and a large headpiece on his head, bearing the symbol of Iwagakure. Towering next to him was an incredibly tall man dressed all in red armor. He had a red kasa on his head and a sleeveless black gi over his armor. Noticeably, everyone on the streets either ignored or glared at them as they walked by. Stubborn old fool, never listens to me. The older man stormed off, still brooding over his last meeting with the Tsuchikage. You're as stubborn as he, Rashi. The taller man easily kept stride with his older companion. Don't give me that, Han. I know you feel the same way. The two paused at the gates for only a moment, then set out of the village. I never said you were wrong. Tsuchikage office. The Tsuchikage and his two assistants, one huge man, and a smaller female, watched from the top of the Tsuchikage's office. Grandpa, I know you're angry and all, but it is truly wise to let them go. The tiny, old Suchikage grunted. I don't care. It's not like that stubborn old fool helped us against him, what point is there in keeping him around? And don't forget, Rashi might try to hide it, but I know he's more hostile towards me since the day Uzumaki was destroyed. The larger man folded his arms. Besides, think of what would happen if we tried to stop them. The Tsuchikage spun around and started walking away. They'll see I'm right and come back soon. If not, we don't need them. Now come gh. The girl laughed as the Tsuchikage threw out his back. Maybe you should retire, Grandpa, Kuratsuchi stated. When it came to Rashi, he was always hostile towards her grandfather, since she could remember. On the other hand, she never really understood why they needed to destroy Uzumaki. They were just Fuinjutsu freaks, but that was as far as they could get. Of course, destroying a valuable ally of Konoha was the right thing to do. Still, the worst part is that you couldn't find anything worthwhile. Her grandfather would constantly moan that they couldn't get any of their scrolls or anything since apparently it was sealed away somewhere within the village, and only an Uzumaki could enter. Grandfather, why is Rashi hostile towards you, and why can't we just seal Yanbi to another Jinchuriki? Rashi is old, she suggested, since doing that would both give Yanbi to a loyal shinobi of the village and kill Rashi. Her grandfather sat and stared at her as she had just grown a second head. Who can possibly seal Yanbi then? We don't have any Fuinjutsu master strong enough to seal a bijou as powerful as Yanbi, and second, don't underestimate the man. He might be old, but he's powerful, and not mention has good control over the demon monkey. Her grandfather replied harshly and decided to leave the office. In a cave. Rashi stood alone against a fire warming him. Han had left him a few hours ago. He wanted to think about his situation, he said. Rashi's hand moved to a secret pocket inside his coat and pulled out a medallion with the Uzumaki symbol in the back. What will you do now, Rashi? Sun suddenly asked. Rashi just kept staring at the medallion, not sure how to answer. Despite having a good friendship with Kokuo, Han never opened the seal. But not Rashi. He had opened the seal for 6 years now, but Sun had decided to stay and help him in whatever he might need. To Rashi, sealing the tailed beasts was like slavery. Bijou human makes no difference. He hated that villages couldn't understand that the bijou had feelings as well. That's why he had told Sun that he could leave the seal if he wanted. I don't know, but I know they are still out there, and maybe the time will come soon, Rashi replied with a slight smile on his face. Son Goku remembered the Uzumaki clan, the only humans that were just how father described how humans are like, wanting peace and understanding between each other. Sun had even helped them a few times, protecting them from danger. Despite having Fuinjutsu masters, they never tried to capture him and seal him away to use for their own gain. But all that stopped when the damn Hashirama captured him and sent him away like he was some mindless beast that just wanted to destroy everything. Sun had almost cried when he heard from Rashi that Uzumaki was destroyed, mercilessly, and for what? Just because they were allies of Hidden Leaf Village. Don't worry, Rashi, I'm sure soon we will meet another one, Sun said. Rashi nodded his head in agreement and decided to hunt in the forest for food. Ashera Uzumaki. She kept swinging her sword. One swing, the branch of the tree fell. The second swing, another one fell. And with one final swing, the whole tree falls, her face sweating, falling in the grass. She used her forearm to wipe the sweat, her katana in her right hand. She was holding it tightly. After she had unlocked her chakra, she had used it in the seal in her wrist. After she had done that, the empty circle in her seal had slowly started growing a small branch that looked to be having the form of a spiral. That wasn't the only thing. And she had received 2 red scrolls from her wrist seal. The first one had the sword she was holding. The leader of Taki told her that it was made of one of the strongest metals known, could efficiently channel chakra through it. The second scroll had a guide on training in chakra, chakra control, elemental manipulation, and 1 fire jutsu to use. Uzumaki style, spiral fire. The leader of Taki had given her 2 chakra papers, one for her and one for Fu, after they had unlocked their chakra. Running, Asha soon reached Fu's home. She looked around but couldn't see her anywhere. Her eyes then went to the lake close to her house and saw her sitting in the water, her legs crossed and closed eyes. Asha sighed in relief and jumped down on the ground, and slowly made her way to Fu. Ashera knew she was probably channeling Komiyai's chakra through her body. So far she could control 1 tael worth of chakra. Fu said that Chomei was the best out of 9 bijou and much friendlier. That made it easier to use her chakra. Suddenly, 2 wings spread from her back. The wings were green in color on edge, slightly transparent in other parts, and looked orange with dark veins around the wings, making it look somewhat like a leaf. The wings were half the size of Fu. She suddenly opened her eyes to look at Asha, who had a raised eyebrow. So? Asha asked. Fu smiled and started flying, much to Ashara's surprise, who couldn't believe her eyes. I can freaking fly, Fu shouted, flying around. You did it, Databane, she shouted happily, and Fu soon landed back to the ground. Her wings slowly moved back. Now, after 1 month we will start academy. Here, Asha said, handing her a chakra paper. Fu grabbed it and raised an eyebrow. Channel your chakra and you can see which affinity you have, Asha stated and explained how to know which affinity she had. Fu nodded in understanding and channeled her chakra in the paper. Asha then saw the paper split in two, but what caught her attention was the grass close to Fu's feet got sliced in half. The first part soaked wet and the other crumpled, showing that she had an affinity for water, lightning, and wind, but Asha wasn't sure why the grass got cut in half. Wow, I have 3 affinities, that's amazing friend Asha, Fu almost shouted from happiness, a big smile not leaving her face and making her look cute. Asha felt happy for her and decided to see which elements she had. She only channeled her chakra for half of the paper to burn to ash, and the other was soaked wet. Asha smiled but noticed the grass got wet close to her feet. Asha jumped happily. Wow, you have fire and water, Fu replied and soon decided to see if they could make any awesome jutsu. Soon after that day, they had started the academy, and to say the students there were complete morons was an understatement. All the boys and girls avoided Fu like she was the plague. A few had tried to talk to Asha, but she had refused to be friends with anyone who didn't like Fu. Some had even warned her to not stay close to the demon, but she had just brushed their warning away like some fly. She and Fu spend most of the time in training since Fu couldn't go to the village and have fun without anyone yelling at her for no reason. Ashara had bought her new clothes and books for her to study and just read stories for fun. One book that had captured her attention was Ika Ika Paradise. She had noticed that the book sold very fast and wondered if the story was very well written. She had tried to buy one, but the seller had told her that she was too young, much to her annoyance. She was 7 years old, that was old enough, right? Asha soon catched her breath and looked at her sword. The blade looked sharp, just like the day it was forged. Asha was about to start practicing her sword fighting again when she heard a loud sound coming from within the forest. She soon ran, thinking that Fu was in danger, only to see her resting in the grass and breathing heavily. Fu, you alright? Asha asked, looking around for any enemy. I did it. Look, Fu replied, pointing at a few trees that looked torn apart. It looked like a drill had pierced them, and some had fallen to the ground. What is this? Asha asked, impressed and walking closer to Fu. Chomei told me this super awesome jutsu is called Wind Style, Wind Tunnel, she replied and her orange eyes looking at the damage. That's a useful jutsu, you're doing very well. Fu Asha complimented her and decided to train her sword fighting again. Not to their knowledge, a pair of eyes looked at them from far away. The creature looked like a human, but half black and half white. He narrowed his eyes at the Nanabai Jinchuriki and soon sunk in the ground like it was never there. Chapter 20, A Song for Tragedy. Naruto, 1 year later. A loud sound was heard throughout the forest. A crater big enough to fill 3 people was in the middle of the forest, and in the middle was the form of one Uzumaki Naruto. His red hair was shining like a ruby from the light of the sun, his left hand still leaking a bit of chakra. His blue eyes looked around the crater, a small smile spread across his face, his fists were getting stronger. Naruto wore his katana tightened to his belt. He stood 134 centimeters tall, wearing a black and red jacket with thin red lines across. The lines gathered in his belly to form a red spiral. Bandages covering his legs, blue shinobi sandals. Beneath the jacket, he wore a thin white shirt with the Uzumaki symbol in the front. His hair reached his shoulders. Toad-Gigi had cut his hair when it started growing to his hips. A paper seal on his right shoulder to use, on his arms, weight seals were 150 pounds in both of his arms, and 170 pounds on his legs. His body had grown slightly muscular, and his face looked sharper. Jumping from the crater, he made his way back to his house. Not much had changed for 1 year. He had completed the first and second training needed for chakra manipulation for all his affinities. For the final training for water affinity, he needed to pull water from the air around. So far, only the second Hokage and a few others were known to complete the last part. He had achieved to gather some water, but not as much as he wanted. Naruto had asked Toad-Gigi about his connection with the Senju clan since he could use wood style like the first and water like the second Hokage was. But Tojiji had no answers on how was that possible, and Naruto couldn't detect lies, so he had dropped the discussion. He needed to create a fire on his hands and stand for 10 minutes to complete fire affinity. Naruto had reached 4 minutes but was still not done yet. Kurama helped him with that particular part, using his chakra. He found it easier to use fire affinity. For earth, he needed to make his skin hard as stone. To use in battles as an enhanced fist or to protect against different attacks. Naruto still hasn't started this one, he wanted to be done with fire and water first. For wind, he needed to separate the flow of the waterfall with wind chakra only. Jiraiya-sensei told him he needed to find a natural waterfall somewhere since the water in Mount Myaboku was slightly different. When it came to Fuinjutsu, he had reached level V, and to pass this one, he needed to create a sealed barrier to protect, a void seal barrier, and chakra detection seal. One that caught Naruto's eyes about Fuinjutsu was level X, he needed to create an empty space seal. For this one, Tojiji told him he couldn't help him like with the others, this one was beyond his knowledge. Naruto didn't know what the seal was supposed to do, but he was sure it was useful or extremely dangerous. But level X raised a problem for Naruto, it was the last level in books written if he wanted to reach even further beyond. He needed books and scrolls from Uzumaki, and all that was sealed away within the village. Both Tojiji and Fukasaka-sama told him that few people that had tried to enter the sealed part of Uzumaki had never returned. For this reason, Naruto had decided to first complete level X and then go to Uzumaki since he didn't know what exactly he needed to do to open the seal. Naruto used his clones every day to learn Fuinjutsu and everything he needed. With his clones, he was able to complete chakra manipulation much faster. Tojiji had praised them and even had bought ramen and a few other foods for him to celebrate. As Naruto walked through the forest, he couldn't help but smile as a bird landed on his shoulder and sang. He loved calm moments like this one, only him and nature and of course, a giant fur ball on his seal. Kurama growled at Naruto's thought but decided to ignore it since it was indeed relaxing and went back to sleep. When it came to his wood style, he had no scrolls to help but could advance on his own. Jiraiya-sensei told him that if he could, he would bring him scrolls from the Senju compound, but Tsunade Senju hasn't been in the village for 7 years now. Naruto now could use 2 new Mokuton jutsus. Wood style, deep forest. The jutsu grew as many trees as the user could by using vast amounts of chakra. The trees could change the landscape and attack the enemy since the trees had sharp ends and could be used to bind someone. Wood style, wood clone. Naruto used this jutsu with how shadow clone worked, but wood clones were different from normal shadow clones. They were much more durable but needed much more chakra than shadow clones, but what they could do, according to Kurama, was that with enough training, he could use his chakra cloak in a clone but only one. Naruto had learned a few new jutsus in his other affinities. Fire style, flaming palm technique. This jutsu allows the user to hold the make spark in their hand. They then amplify it with their chakra until it is a small flame. By mimicking the gentle fist style, they push the flame into their opponent, causing clothes to light or minor burns on the body. Water release, evil windmill water shuriken. The user creates one or more large Fuma shurikens made of water and launches it towards the enemy. The shuriken causes massive damage when hitting an enemy. It is also much more solid than the usual water shurikens and can easily parry other kunais and shurikens that come in its path. Wind release, pressure damage. It creates a small tornado that sucks everything around. The enemy sucked can be caused severe cuts around the body and even death if used with more chakra. Naruto heard from Fukasaku that his godfather was looking for Tsunade. Naruto hoped to meet her soon. He knew she was his godmother and wondered how she was, but at the same time wondered why would she leave him alone amongst the wolves. Alone in a village full of hatred. Naruto suddenly felt another bird landing on his head. Naruto slowly pulled a finger close to his head. The bird flew to his finger and looked at Naruto. He smiled brightly and decided to reach his house. While walking, Naruto turned to his right to see Gamakichi looking at him. "Gamakichi, how are you doing?" Naruto asked, smiling, looking down at the small toad. He kneeled. "Good Naruto-kun, hoping we could play again," Gamakichi suggested. Naruto nodded his head since he was sure he could spend some time with the little toad. As he was following Gamakichi, Naruto thought about the Phoenix contract. He wondered what would happen if he made a contract with both Toad and Phoenix. He knew there was a high chance that he would never find the contract, but if he did, he hoped to use it. Naruto sighed heavily and decided to put that thought at the back of his head. Later, Naruto soon reached the house, and to his surprise, Ma and Fukasaku were waiting in front of his door. "Fukasaku-sama, is everything alright?" Naruto asked worriedly. "Everything is alright, Naruto-kun, but Jiraiya-boy will soon arrive. He said he had something important," Fukasaku stated. Naruto raised an eyebrow but decided to just wait for him inside. He opened a bowl with ramen from a store that Tojiji had brought him. While eating, he also ate a few fruits like carrots, tomatoes which Naruto didn't like much, and kale. Both Jiraiya and Fukasaku had told him to eat healthy foods. After eating, he suddenly felt Tojiji just behind his door. He turned his head in time for the door to open. Walking inside was Tojiji smiling. "Naruto, is good to see you, my boy," Jiraiya greeted him. Naruto hugged him, and the old Tojiji hugged him back. Jiraiya looked at him proudly. Naruto reminded him so much of both Minato and Kushina. "I'm fine, sensei," he replied. "Very well, Naruto, there has been a small change of plans," Tojiji stated, and Naruto frowned, thinking it was the time for him to return to the village. Jiraiya noticed Naruto's face and immediately raised his hands. "No, is not what you think. The 9 months we will spend in roaming around the elemental nations," his Tojiji stated smiling, and Naruto jumped on his feet with his fists in the air. "Yada," he shouted and looked back at him. "Where are we going?" Naruto asked but suddenly remembered that he would have to leave Mount Myaboku. He slightly lowered his gaze and head. Jiraiya noticed it and put a hand on his shoulder for support. Naruto looked up at him. "Don't worry, Naruto, you will meet them whenever you need their help," Jiraiya said, reassuring him. After a few moments, Naruto nodded his head. "Now first we will go to Taki. There are many waterfalls there for you to complete your wind manipulation," Jiraiya stated. Still, at the same time, he didn't tell him that the Nanabai Jinchuriki was there and hoped that meeting someone like himself would lift his spirit even more. And possibly have a female friend. "Alright," Naruto said, agreeing with the plan, and followed him outside. Walking outside, Naruto's eyes widened to see Fukasaku, Ma, Gamapunta, the boss of the Toads, and Gamakichi. Walking outside, he saw Fukasaku handing him a large scroll. Naruto grabbed it and opened it to see that it was the Toad summoning contract. He looked at Jiraiya-sensei, who nodded his head at him. He smiled, and Naruto bit his finger enough to draw blood and slowly wrote his name in the contract. "You are now officially a member of ours," Fukasaku-sama stated proudly. Even Kurama was fully awake and was listening with a grin on his face. "Thank you, Fukasaku-sama," Naruto said, smiling gratefully that he had their support and trust. "I hope to see you again soon," Ma said, and so did Gamabunta and Gamakichi. Jiraiya waved at him, and he stood close to him. Tojiji made a few hand signs and slammed his wide-open hand in the ground, and everything went white. Naruto suddenly was somewhere else. The first thing he noticed was that he stood in a forest somewhere. Close to him was Tojiji slowly standing on his feet. Naruto turned to him and waited for him to say what they would do next. "Now, you will follow me, Naruto," the old Sannin stated. Naruto just nodded his head and followed him, wanting to see more of the world. He had enjoyed his time in Mount Myaboku, but he missed talking to someone else except his sensei and Toads. "Okay, Naruto, while we are walking I have a new chakra control exercise for you," the white-haired man spoke, taking out a black metal ball the size of his fist and chucking it to Naruto, who caught it. "Wow, this thing is heavy, Tojiji, what am I supposed to do with it?" Naruto asked curiously as to what his new exercise would be. He knew this wasn't needed for his elemental manipulation. "I want you to explode this balloon filled with water using your chakra only," Jiraiya said, and Naruto got to work, but the task was proving difficult. "So in how many places you have been, Tojiji?" Naruto asked, detaching his canteen from his utility belt and taking a sip of refreshing water. They had been traveling for 2 days now, journeying from town to town, city to city. "In many places, Naruto. I have been in Kyomogakure, the village is more like living in clouds, but still very beautiful. Have been in Kiri, not really my cup of tea. And have been in Suna a few times, even with your father," Tojiji replied smiling, remembering the old times of him with Minato. Naruto was surprised to hear that. "Really? Why were you there?" Naruto asked, since he knew that Suna was an ally of Konoha, and they weren't probably there because of war. "When Minato became Hokage, he went to the village a few times. I tagged along," Jiraiya answered, and Naruto felt and noticed the melancholy in his voice. Almost like opening a closed wound. "What about IWA?" Naruto asked, since IWA and Konoha were like oil and water, just can't combine them. "No, The last time I was in IWA territory was during the war, not for fun, the old Sannin replied and kept walking towards Taki. What kind of chakra control exercise is this anyway? I've been trying for days but the damn thing won't pop. Can't I just use clones to do it for me? It'd sure as hell cut down the time process. No, Jiraiya replied sternly as he had done so many times before when posed with the question. Now get cracking, we still got a long way ahead of us. You know, this isn't like anything I expected when you told me you were going to be teaching me a new jutsu, Naruto complained as he channeled his chakra into the water balloon, willing it to burst. It was much harder than it sounded, popping a water balloon with chakra, and though Jiraiya had yet to tell him what this chakra exercise was for, Naruto persevered, intent on finding it out on his own. He had nothing but time to kill anyway as they journeyed to their destinations on foot. But couldn't understand why his sensei wasn't letting him use clones to speed up the process. Jiraiya didn't respond and kept walking. Naruto would have liked nothing better than to pelt Jiraiya with the water balloon. Still, he had been given the impression this exercise was too important for him to waste the balloons on such childish escapades. So the young Jinchuriki continued to channel chakra through the balloon and tried to manipulate the water inside the balloon to explode. But Naruto couldn't help but wonder where he had heard about this exercise. Try spinning, Jiraiya suggested after a while. Spinning? Naruto repeated. All right. Naruto conceded after another moment of silence. He closed his eyes and drew a deep breath as he exercised as much possible control over his chakra as he channeled it into the balloon. Spin, spin. Spin, damn it. Naruto almost jumped as he felt the water spin in the water balloon rapidly. I did it, I'm doing it. Naruto hadn't expected to be this excited over achieving some progression, but he was. Now to up the chakra output. With a snapping sound, the water balloon burst, and Naruto's right hand felt wet. Hell yeah, it worked! He punched the air, and Jiraiya shot him an approving smile over his shoulder. So what now, Tojiji? Just keep practicing, Jiraiya threw another water balloon over his shoulder. Tomorrow. The midday sun shined down on the world from a clear, nearly cloudless sky. It was another one of the beautiful days the Land of Fire was known for. The songs of birds and the cries of cicadas could be heard flowing along with the slight breeze that flowed through the area as the forest critters went about facing another day of life. As the sun rays bathed the land in its light and warmth and the sounds of nature echoed through the ground, two figures walked down a dirt path between a deep forest and a gushing river. The first was a fairly tall man, standing just over 6 feet tall. He had spiky white hair tied in a ponytail that trailed down to his waist and framed his face in a pair of bangs. He wore an unusual, horned forehead protector that bore the kanji for oil instead of the sign of his village. He wore a green kimono shirt with matching pants held by a black belt over mesh armor and white hair with 2 yellow circles on its sides and wooden geta sandals. He had 2 red lines trailing down from his eyes and had the summon scroll of the toad strapped to his back. He was none other than Jiraiya of the Sannin, one of the world's most famous, and infamous with the ladies, shinobi. The other was a young boy, moving to the side of the road to get a better view of the walled town in the distance, close enough that it could be seen but too far to make out any of its features. He had spiky red hair and ocean blue eyes. This was Naruto Uzumaki, Jinchuriki of the Kyubi, Kurama. How long before we reach Taki? Naruto asked, looking up at his sensei. What kind of place is Taki? Even though the whole purpose of this trip was his training, they'd done nothing for the past 4 days. They'd visited 2 villages and 1 city in the Land of Fire, and so far, the Sannin had left him to practice his elemental manipulation while he went off doing God knows what. Sometimes, he said he'd needed to meet a contact, but other times the redhead thought the Sannin was just doing nasty stuff. It's over here, Jiraiya said, pointing his thumb to the trees as the blonde turned around to look at him. If I remember right, there should be a lake just past here. Seems like as good a place as any to start. With that, the Sannin turned away from the path, brushing aside some of the foliage in his way as he stepped beyond the tree line and said over his shoulder, "Come on, kid, this way." But he needn't have bothered, the redhead was already in pursuit of his sensei. It wasn't long before the two found themselves in a large clearing surrounding a lake, just as the toad summoner predicted. The sun reflected off the crystal-clear waters as the large man took stock of the location and nodded to himself. Naruto took off his backpack, laying it against the trunk of a nearby tree before joining his sensei. "So, what are we doing here?" he asked, but thinking about the exercise that Tojiji had given him. He found it strange to be a normal chakra control exercise and did not mention that exercise wasn't in the book about chakra control, and Naruto's chakra control was already good. Jiraiya looked around and made sure that no one was around before turning to Naruto. He smirked and cracked his knuckles. "You ready?" Jiraiya suddenly asked before Naruto could ask, "Ready about what?" Jiraiya moved in front of him and slammed a seal on his forehead. Backing away immediately, Naruto felt Kurama's chakra flowing through him, but this time felt different. He felt more relaxed. His body didn't feel like something was tearing his way into him. Naruto's whiskers grew, looking more intimidating. His nails grew as large as that of a fox. His teeth slowly grew and sharp enough to tear flesh. His eyes turned red. A red chakra cloak slowly covered Naruto around like a blanket. The part around his head grew 2 large ears. A tail slowly grew behind him. Naruto slowly stood on his 4. The amount of chakra with one tail felt less overwhelming. Before, it felt like trying to fill a vodka glass using a swimming pool full of water. "Naruto," Kurama suddenly said, concerned that he might lose control again. Naruto kept his gaze at Tojiji. Jiraiya kept vigilant in case Naruto suddenly attacked. But he wasn't moving, breathing heavily. He took a deep breath and felt relaxed again. A smile slowly spread on his face, and his red eyes turned to look at Tojiji, who smiled back. "Well done, Kit," Kurama complimented him. Naruto kept the chakra cloak around. He wanted to get used to it. Kurama warned him to not try to use more than one tail worth of chakra. "Thanks, Kurama," Naruto said on his head, and Kurama's chakra slowly vanished, turning Naruto to normal. "Well done, my boy, let's rest here for some time," Jiraiya suggested, and Naruto nodded in agreement since he suddenly felt exhausted and wanted to sleep. Hidden hideout. A man using a cane slowly walked through a long corridor. The silence was overwhelming around him but not his mind. He had many thoughts and questions that had no answers. Right now, he was getting closer than ever to having Izanagi on his own hands. He had 3 now, but once the plan was done, he will have 10 Izanagi to secure his safety and immortality in a way. Danzo wasn't a fool. He knew Izanagi wouldn't make him younger, or anything like that's why he was after the daughter and the woman many years ago. Uzumaki clan was known for their lifespan. He needed them to experiment and perhaps find a way to use their cells to enhance his body. Live longer and make sure to lead Hidden Leaf to where it belongs, complete power over the elemental nations. His thoughts were on the Jinchuriki of Kyubi. He had left the village for 3 years now, and Hiruzen wasn't talking. Just the thought of his old teammate telling him that he's the Hokage and he can't demand things made him clench his hand around the cane. But what surprised him even more was him being able to use wood style. The shinobi was about to use his kunai to slice the demon's throat. I was about to stop him when trees suddenly grew and killed the whole mob. Danzo grunted that the shinobi had tried to ignore his orders to leave the weapon alive, but having wood style. With him in my hands, training him correctly, he can easily take all the bijou around the world and bring them back to Konoha as it should have been if Hashirama-sama had kept the bijou. The other 4 hidden villages would bend the knee to their betters. Danzo thought stopped when a big door opened in front of him. Walking outside, in the grass, stood Itachi Uchiha. The boy had done his job well. The Uchiha clan needed to go. "Hokage might have told you to wait, but we have no time if the Uchiha clans start their rebellion. Will leave us weak and vulnerable. What will stop the likes of Kumo or Iwa to conquer Konoha?" Danzo stated with an emotionless tone. The dark eyes of Itachi showed no emotions, but inside he was questioning everything. "Kill your clan and your brother gets to live, or you can join them." Danzo offered the choice to him. Itachi closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He opened his eyes to look at Danzo. "I will do it," he stated with a fully matured Sharingan. Later, Itachi stood at the top of a pole, looking down as his little brother ran towards the clan. With a genjutsu, he made him take a long way around before disappearing into the darkness. Quickly moving through the shadows, Itachi walked inside the first house he came across without thinking, swung his swords and sliced them open. Blood flew like a waterfall. He didn't even see their faces. Not even their eyes, just the sound of blood. Itachi closed his heart to their suffering and swung again and again and again. Kill after kill. Slice after slice. House after house. Killing everyone, except the police of Uchiha clan. Someone else took care of that. As he moved silently through the shadows, his eyes went to a certain girl. Izumi, her beautiful eyes, were looking directly at him. But there was no fear in her eyes, a small smile spread on her face despite seeing the blood all around his body. Itachi closed his eyes and made his decision. With a powerful genjutsu known as Tsukuyomi, he showed her how it could have been together. How it should have been, if only if the world wasn't so unforgiving. Itachi and Izumi stood together beneath a tree, Izumi resting her head on his chest and his fingers caressing her hair. One step. Itachi and Izumi stood together holding hands, they swore to love each other until death. One more step. Her name will be Akayuki, Izumi whispered in Itachi's ear as he kissed her belly growing. One tear. Holding hands, they stood together, looking at their children playing, 2 daughters and 1 boy. Akayuki, Serena and Shursui. One swing of the sword. Chapter 21, Alone. Naruto woke up after sleeping for 7 hours now. It had been 3 days since he sparred with Tojiji since he was able to use 1 tail worth of chakra. Kurama stated that now going to 2 tails worth of chakra will be easier than going from 0 to 1. Of course, Kurama had warned him the real challenge would be when he would want to reach 4 tails worth of chakra. Kurama didn't elaborate why holding 4 tails was harder. Naruto decided to ignore it for now since it was irrelevant for now. His sensei warned him that just because he could use Kurama's chakra, he should not be dependent on it, use it only as a last resort. Naruto, while I'm happy that you can use Kyuubi's chakra, you should use it only if you have no other choice, Jiraiya stated thoughtfully. Naruto was about to open his mouth when the old Sannin raised his hand. I'm sure you know about the Sharingan, Naruto. It is a handy tool, but the Uchiha clan highly depends on it. They would be far stronger if everything they do weren't connected to their Sharingan in one way or another. The same is for you, get stronger on your own. I know you are already doing that, but don't change your mind, Jiraiya stated, and they returned to their walk towards Taki. Naruto was already using Kurama's chakra only if needed. Right now, he was trying to complete the second exercise that Tojiji told him he should do. It was slowly driving him mad. The exercise was much more complicated than he had thought. But Naruto couldn't help but wonder what exactly was he doing. He knew this wasn't a chakra control exercise, so what jutsu was he trying to do? So, Naruto, tell me, how do you feel that you will soon return to the village? Jiraiya suddenly asked in front of him. He was walking 1 meter further from Naruto. He kept quiet, waiting for Naruto's response. The red hair frowned and lowered his head slightly. If he was honest, the only thing he was looking forward to was to meet his old friends, and that's about it. Naruto was sure that the village had not forgotten. For all they cared, they probably thought he was dead somewhere. And the moment he returned, it wouldn't take long for word to spread that the demon fox had returned ready to kill them all. Naruto snorted at the question and looked up again at his sensei. Not really looking forward to it. I don't think much has changed for 3 years, he replied honestly. Jiraiya didn't turn to him but just listened to his answer. Well, we still have 9 months left in our belt, and don't forget you will go to the academy, he reminded him. Naruto raised an eyebrow, and he was slightly looking forward to the academy, wondering what they taught them there and how strong the students were there. I hope the academy is something, Naruto replied, and they kept making their way towards Taki. After 6 days. They had been walking for how many days now? Naruto didn't know, but Jiraiya sensei told him they were getting closer. He had made improvements in his jutsu. His already good chakra control helped him to make improvements in the jutsu. They soon stopped walking, and Jiraiya sensei walked away in the nearby town for research. Naruto didn't know what that was but decided to ignore it since it was probably something important that didn't involve him. Naruto stood in the middle of the grass, a tree close to him. Wind on his face, his red hair dancing with the wind. Naruto slowly raised his hand and fully opened it, and tried to concentrate. He didn't know what jutsu was, but the chakra control needed to do it spoke a powerful one. Slowly his chakra gathered in the middle of his palm and gradually became a small blue sphere, and the chakra was moving violently everywhere around the sphere. Naruto gritted his teeth slightly since it wasn't easy. He felt a pain in his hand. Looking at the jutsu, Naruto understood what jutsu his sensei was teaching him. Rasengan, Naruto whispered, shock written all over his face. A smile spread on his face, and he had learned a powerful jutsu from his father. He had intended to understand it, but he thought that he was ready for it. Naruto could feel the winds moving violently around, even making minor scratches in the skin of the tree nearby. He felt the pain growing in his right palm without thinking twice. He rushed at the tree and slammed his right hand on it. The Rasengan drilled the tree through, piercing it like a knife through butter. The sound of a tree falling was heard throughout the forest. Naruto was panting, and he slowly looked at his right hand to see it bleeding from various places. He even felt a sharp pain on his big finger. Gritting his teeth from the pain, he knew his finger was probably broken, but he didn't let himself scream. Naruto kept his mouth shut and screamed inside, but not leaving a single complaint leaving his mouth. "I did it, Two-chan," Naruto said with a low tone, smiling, looking upwards at what was left of the tree. Due to the damage, the upper part had fallen in the ground. Kurama was slowly healing his hand. Naruto slowly rested his head in the ground, his left hand behind his head to use as a pillow, his blue eyes smiling, looking up at the blue sky. Clouds were moving around. Now, he understood why Shikamaru found this relaxing. "You did it," Naruto heard a voice and turned to look at his sensei smiling, who glanced at the tree. He smiled and walked close to his godson. "Why didn't you tell me I was learning Rasengan?" Naruto asked, looking at his right. Toji chuckled and rubbed his red hair. "I wanted you to be surprised, and congratulations for breaking my record. It took 3 years for your father to create it, 16 months for me to master it," Jiraiya stated, smiling proudly and turning to look at Naruto. You needed only 2 weeks of training," he finished, his face smiling and brightened up from the sun. He slowly sat beside him, he glanced at his right palm and turned to look at Naruto. Then suddenly, his face turned to serious again. "Naruto, I know you hold no love for the Leaf Village. I can't blame you. All I'm asking for you is, whatever happens, don't change, don't seek vengeance. This world has enough of it," he said quietly and turned to look at the sun slowly hiding behind the mountains. "The shinobi world is full of vengeance, hate, love, and greed. In this world, as long as there's a concept of more and less, there will always be those who want more. And the want for more will awaken the worst nature in humans. Greed," the old Sannin stated, his eyes looking at the mountains, his face showed pain. "Whatever happens, Naruto, wherever life guides, you should know, no matter what. You will always be my godson," Jiraiya stated. Naruto looked at his Toji with a smile, hot tears slowly rolling down his cheek and falling in the grass. He wiped his tears with his forearm and looked at his grandfather in all but name. "Thank you for being here for me, grandfather," Naruto stated softly, his head resting against the old Sannin's back. His white hair rested against Naruto's red ones. Jiraiya closed his eyes, a sad smile spread on his face. Being with Naruto made him think of Tsunade. Of their loss, sometimes he dreamed of how could have been if only. Sighing, he took a deep breath and enjoyed the moment with Naruto. Hidden place. Somewhere in a dark underground cave, 2 figures stood together, where the only sound that could be heard was the slow dripping of water falling from stalactites. After a few minutes, 6 more shadowy figures appeared, one after the other. The only discernible feature that linked the 8 figures together was the red clouds on their black cloaks, indicating that they were members of the Akatsuki. "The last time we all met like this was 3 years ago when Orochimaru joined the organization," said one of the figures. "So, what's the occasion?" "We have a new member in the Akatsuki, Itachi Uchiha," the man spoke with a strong and deep tone. His purple eyes with 4 dark circles around him, with black orbs around his face, 3 on his nose and several in both of his ears. Orange hair and the emblem of the village hidden in the rain with a long cut through the forehead protector, indicating that he was a missing nin. Everyone turned to look at the new member. Itachi moved slowly, his fully matured Sharingan showed to everyone. One of the shadow figures licked his lips with a very long tongue looking at Itachi. His yellow eyes are like that of a predator. He was looking for worthy prey. Itachi looked at the eyes of the leader, and his Sharingan focused on his eyes. "Rinnegan," he whispered. He had heard of the eye, but to see someone wielding the legendary Jutsu. He stooped in front of the leader and kneeled. Beside him was a woman with blue hair, a flower made of paper in her hair. Her face was emotionless. Itachi stood up, but he knew there was a third one in the cave watching them. A man with a mask. He was hiding his pain from the world. "Itachi Uchiha, our newest member of the Akatsuki. From now on, you will call me Leader Sama," he stated and handed him a ring. Itachi took it and put it in his ring finger. "The objective of the Akatsuki is to reach true peace. Our objective is to collect all the tailed beasts," the leader stated to him with a firm tone. Itachi nodded in understanding and closed his eyes for a second. "I hope you keep your promise." Hidden Sand Village. This happened today. The fourth Kazekage asked without looking up from the paperwork on his desk. Yes. But actually, it's been happening more frequently than I've been letting you know. The Kazekage finally looked up at Yoshimaru, who was standing in front of his desk with his arms behind his back. How frequently? Well, you know he's always had these little outbursts, but lately, they have become more severe. I think I started noticing an increase in his violent behavior after his 5th birthday. So this has been happening for over a year then? Yes, Kazekage. For the first time in his life, Yoshimaru noticed an uneasiness in the Kazekage. He leaned on his desk with his elbow and rested his head in his hand. With his free hand, he rapidly tapped his fingers on the desk as if trying to beat down some kind of internal panic. The Kazekage took a deep breath and looked up at Yoshimaru once more. But, he's always had these outbursts. What makes this one any different? Precisely what happened today. It was in the playground. He attacked 2 other children. The Kazekage stared past him and was silent. Yoshimaru felt that he should continue to explain. As I said before, we both know he's always behaved this way. I'm not saying that this time is any different. I'm just saying it was a more severe attack. In fact, I'm certain he would have killed them if I hadn't intervened. The Kazekage reverted his eyes back to Yoshimaru and stared at him for a few moments as if studying him. Then he raised his brow, noticing his bandages for the first time. Are those from him? Yoshimaru nodded. The Kazekage closed his eyes as if to escape the world. Another moment of silence followed. Then, I knew this day would come. I created this child, this monster, in the hope that he would be a successful weapon. Yes, the ultimate weapon. With him, our military would be unstoppable. These words made Yoshimaru sick. He cringed internally, remembering the Kazekage's dark secret that so few knew about. The secret that, unfortunately, Yoshimaru was cursed with knowing about. He knew about the Kazekage's overpowering hunger for power and military strength. He knew about the demon and the unwilling human sacrifice that was used to seal the demon inside the child. The child, the Kazekage's son. Gaara. The ultimate weapon. The ultimate weapon. The Kazekage continued, but now it seems he has become more of a threat to the village than something to aid it in becoming powerful. The Kazekage opened his eyes and shook his head. I knew this day would come. He repeated. I've known for quite some time. There have been rumors for years. Yoshimaru felt another wave of nausea. He knew what rumors the Kazekage was talking about. The rumors have been spreading ever since the Kazekage's wife was killed in a mysterious accident, right after the birth of his 3rd child. The Kazekage's wife. Yoshimaru's sister, the unwilling human sacrifice. I can't let this go any farther. The Kazekage said. I can't let people keep talking about things that they don't understand. He shot a threatening glare at Yoshimaru as if accusing him of being involved in the rumors. But Yoshimaru was without fault. He had kept quiet about the ordeal for 6 years. Because honestly, he was afraid of his sick and twisted brother-in-law. This has to stop now. The Kazekage said. Today. He must be destroyed. Destroyed? Yoshimaru asked as if contemplating the meaning of the word. I want my son Gaara to be killed. Tonight. You will be perfect for this job, Yoshimaru. Tonight. That is an order. Killed? Tonight? Yes. You are going to follow your Kazekage's orders, aren't you? Yes, Kazekage, it's just. I don't know, he's so strong, the sand. I don't know if anyone can accomplish killing him. You fool. Let me remind you that Gaara is the very reason your sister is no longer with us. Yoshimaru looked at the floor. Yes, he knew this was true. Gaara was the cause of his sister's death. Not the Kazekage. The Kazekage was working toward making the village more powerful. He was trying to improve things. He wasn't really doing anything wrong. It was Gaara that was at fault. He was the cause of all this pain. Yoshimaru had lied to himself for years. He told himself that the Kazekage was a psychopathic monster when the real monster had always been Gaara. He had convinced himself that he loved Gaara. That he was all that was left of his sister. But now, he found that he was being truthful with himself. He hated Gaara. He always had. Everything wrong in his life could be traced back to Gaara. Gaara was the reason his sister was dead. Gaara was the reason he was no longer allowed to spend time with his other nephew Kankuro or his niece Temari. It was because of Gaara. Gaara was too dangerous, and Yashimaru had to devote all of his time to making sure that Gaara didn't kill anyone, throwing himself in front of Gaara's victims. He looked down at the bandages on his arms and reached up and touched the one on his head. He had been ordered to take care of Gaara from birth, 6 years of torture. But now, the Kazekage's orders were different. Now Yashimaru could finally be free of this demon that was his nephew. So, have you changed your mind? The Kazekage asked, realizing that he had successfully convinced Yashimaru. Yes. I'll try my best, but his strength. I still don't know. Night. Yashimaru walked through the endless dark alleys and streets of Suna. The sun had set, and the usually scorching desert air was cool. It was quiet, and hardly anyone was out on the road tonight. Silence. Yashimaru paused for a few seconds and stood motionless on the street, trying to remember exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. He thought of the Kazekage, then thought of the Kazekage's wife, then of their 2 children Temari and Kankuro. As he thought of his family, a smile crossed his masked face. He pictured all of them standing in front of him with smiles on their faces as well. Everything had once been so excellent. They had all been so happy. His thoughts reverted back to his sister again, and he remembered the day that started it all. Yashimaru. The Kazekage has asked me to marry him. I'm so happy, Yashimaru. She had yelled as she wrapped her arms around her brother. His mind began to fill with other happy memories. It's a girl, Yashimaru, a daughter. Her name is Temari. Isn't she beautiful? I'm a mommy. And you're an uncle, Yashimaru. An uncle. I have to admit that I was hoping for a son, but something tells me that this little princess will be as tough as any son that I could have had. The Kazekage had said. Yashimaru then thought of how happy the Kazekage was when he found out that their second child was a boy. Yashimaru felt his smile fall into a frown as he thought of the third child. He pictured the red-headed demon that had ruined everything. Then his thoughts reverted back to his sister once more, and he confirmed with himself that what he was about to do was justified. Revenge. Gaara stood alone on a rooftop staring at the full moon, the wind flying over him when he heard a sound behind him before he had time to look who was behind. His sand moved behind his back, protecting him from 3 kunai. Gaara turned to look who attacked him, only to see a man wearing a dark hoodie. He saw the sand moving towards the man, and he wanted it to stop, not hurt anymore. He tried to yell, to scream, but all his words died on his throat when the man pulled out a short sword and jumped in the air to slash his head. Without thinking, without saying anything, his hands moved on their own, and the sand flew towards the man like ocean. He soon was covered everywhere in sand, stronger than steel. Gaara couldn't understand why no one loved him. Closing the fist, a cry was heard as Gaara felt rain on his face. Rain? His right hand slowly touched his cheek, but he saw blood instead. All around him, blood. Gaara looked at the man who attacked him, shaking. He grabbed his hood and removed it to see his uncle. His hands started shaking, and so did his voice. WH. He stuttered, unable to talk. I'm sorry, Gaara, but your father ordered me to kill you, he said. Spitting out blood, his face pale, his blood all around his clothes. You cowl. Couldn't say n. No, Gaara said as more tears rolled down his cheek. I could. But I hated you, Gaara. You were the reason my sister. D. His voice stopped. Gaara screamed in grief, and everything went dark. Naruto. Takigakure. Few foreigners would ever lay eyes upon this, one of a small handful of truly hidden villages among the elemental continents. A pity, because it was a wonderful place, made up of traditional, Eastern-style buildings, most of which were carefully and caringly constructed as if by a master carpenter, built around the walls of a little, circular valley full of plant life, around a massive, crystal-clear lake, at the heart of which lied an island where their administration building lied, resting at the base of the gargantuan, sacred tree of Taki, whose canopy covered the entire village. Beams of sunlight shined through its branches, illuminating the concealed village. The roof of the valley was hidden under a powerful genjutsu which was constantly monitored. It was an S-class secret of the village, and any outsider that stumbled upon it was quickly dealt with. even the commonly used entrance as well, if a little obviously hidden, an underwater cave system behind a massive waterfall. It was thanks to the lengths they went to keep their home hidden that the village had only once been successfully invaded, and that mark on their village's pride had occurred solely due to the actions of a traitor. Naruto suddenly came out from a lake. He turned when he heard others emerge from the water's surface behind him. Out of the clear, blue water came a kunoichi of the village, wearing Taki's standard shinobi attire, followed by Jiraiya of the Sannin, blindfolded and by the look on his face, none too happy about having been dragged sightless through the hidden entrance of the village. Naruto held back a snicker as he used his chakra to rise out of and stand on the water, his sensei and their escort doing the same a moment later. Due to the crisis at the time, Shibuki had been forced to show him the entrance to the village, making blindfolding him a moot point. As he rose, Jiraiya took off the blindfold and turned his eyes to the tree. Taki was undoubtedly a nice place, though, in this Sannin's opinion, it was short on public bathhouses and hot springs, but, oh well. If you'll follow me, I'll escort you to see Lord Shibuki. The kunoichi said as she turned to the teacher and student duo. He's been expecting you, Master Jiraiya. I'm sure he'll be surprised to see who you've brought along. So, you never said. What is it you want to talk to Shibuki about anyway? Jiraiya shook his head. Sorry, kid, it's a secret. He said, smirking at his student's obvious annoyance. In short order, the trio had entered the administrative building and walked down its halls. The kunoichi opened the door for them and allowed them to enter. Shibuki sat behind a desk, filing away a completed form and reaching for the next one when he heard the door open. Thankful for a brief respite from the never-ending monotony of paperwork, he looked up and smiled amiably. Welcome, Master Jiraiya. It's been quite some time since you last visited us. So, what brings you here, Master Jiraiya? For business, he replied. And glanced down at Naruto, who rolled his eyes before leaving the office. Naruto walked across the bridge leading from the center island to the village proper, wondering what he would do with himself while his sensei was talking about whatever it was he was being so secretive about. It annoyed him to no end that the man kept this from him, but there was no point dwelling on it. Stepping off the bridge and walking the streets, the redhead looked around at the people that went about their daily business. As he looked around, Naruto noticed that he was receiving many looks. Because of how secretive and secluded the village was, outsiders stuck out like a sore thumb even though it was fairly large. He could see them staring at him and feel their gaze on his back, and every once in a while, whispers concerning him would reach his ears. It was something he was pretty used to. After all, he grew up receiving hateful glares and cruel whispers from the people of his own village as he grew up. Naruto kept walking when he heard a massive amount of chakra in a large forest close to the village. He didn't know where this chakra came from. Kurama inside could feel his sister close and was about to tell Naruto to go and check it out when Naruto had already started moving towards the forest. Kurama, do you feel this? Naruto asked him since he could feel this had a huge amount of chakra, almost like a bijou. It seems you noticed it. It looks like my sister is close by, Kurama replied, smirking. Naruto smiled and moved even faster. Soon he reached the forest center and was surprised to see an enormous tree he had ever seen. But his gaze turned to two girls fighting close to the lake. But Naruto froze when he felt the chakra of the redhead. She's an Uzumaki. Chapter 22, A Dream of Home. Ashera Uzumaki. Swing after swing, Fu was blocking them with her short sword that Lord Shiboku had brought for her to train in Kenjutsu. Her sword had an orange pommel and a dark scabbard with green lines around. The number 7 was carved in her scabbard. In Japanese, Ashera was wearing a tight red shirt underneath a black shirt. Her kunai holster was tightened around her right leg. Her scabbard of the sword tightened behind her back. She wore bandages on her right forearm and left forearm. Her skin around her hand was slightly irritated and bleeding somewhat from minor cuts around her knuckles and palm. She had bandages around her knee, wearing dark shinobi sandals. Ashera dodged her attack and swung at her head but stopped before it hit her, her blade close to her neck. Fu smiled warmly and put her small sword back in its scabbard, which was tightened to her hips. You did good, Fu, Ashera complimented, slightly sweating from her forehead, while Fu didn't look that tired. She looked normal like always, perhaps it was because of Chome, Asha didn't really know, but it didn't matter. It had been 6 hours since they started sparring. And eventually, Asha got tired, and she liked the most to train in Fuinjutsu and Kenjutsu. Ashera was about to return to the treehouse and rest and then train in her Fuinjutsu when Fu's orange eyes looked over her shoulder. "Come out, I know you're there," Fu shouted, but much to Ashera's surprise, her friend didn't look tense, and her hands were resting on her hips and not going to her pommel. Ashera turned around in time to see a boy around her age slowly walk out from behind the tree, but what immediately caught her attention was his long red hair, and the chakra he was leaking was way too similar to hers. It reminded her of her father's hair in a way. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to spy. I just felt your chakra and wanted to check it out," the boy explained and pointed the finger at Fu. Ashera was about to ask what was his name and possibly last name, but Fu beat her to it. "Is alright, number 9, we're friends here," Fu replied, smiling with a cute smile and her hands resting behind her head. Asha's eyes widened at the name Fu called her, and she understood this one here was the Jinchuriki of the Kyubi but wondered why he was even here. It is not usually that villages leave their Jinchuriki to leave the village, and this boy was far away from Konoha. The boy smiled and walked closer, his hands looked relaxed, almost like he was talking to a friend, and he didn't have to think anything wrong would happen. Asha noticed it and decided to relax. "So she told you, Furball inside me wants to say hi to you too, number 7, the boy replied, smiling and walking closer. "Oh, that's good coming from him. But can I know your name, friend?" Fu asked, walking beside Asha, who still was quiet the whole time. Fu was pleased to see a former Jinchuriki, but what caught her attention is that Chomei had told her that from all 9-tailed beasts, Kyubi and Ichibi were the cockiest ones and the ones that hated humans the most. And the way her new friend was talking, as if he knew Kyubi very well, almost like talking about a friend. Naruto, on the other hand, was slightly more interested in the Uzumaki girl next to him. As far as he knew, she was family to him. "Oh right, my name is Naruto Uzumaki," he introduced himself with an open hand on his chest. Ashara's eyes widened at his last name. "He's an Uzumaki. I'm not alone. I knew I wasn't the only Uzumaki, Databane," Asha thought to herself, her smile spread on her face, even her eyes were smiling. Fu was just as surprised and was about to introduce herself and Asha. "My name is Ashera Uzumaki, and the loudmouth beside me is Fu." Asha introduced herself and pointed the finger at Fu, whose eye twitched at being called that. "So I was right, is good to meet family," Naruto said, smiling at Asha. He felt both good and relieved to meet an Uzumaki but to meet a Jinchuriki as well. Asha smiled at being called family, but at the same time, wondering where he came from since she hadn't seen him before in Taki, and she was sure she would have noticed another redhead around. "How about we go to my house and talk there?" Fu suddenly suggested. Both Naruto and Asha nodded their heads. They soon reached the treehouse. Naruto still looked impressed by the size of the tree and wondered if he could ever grow a tree as large as this one. "This house is beautiful," Naruto complimented, and they walked up to the door. "Naruto, as much as I enjoy meeting family, but where did you come from? I don't remember seeing you before," Asha asked, and hoping that he was a ninja of Taki so he could stay here. Naruto turned his head to her. His blue eyes looked amazing, almost like the ocean itself. It reminded her of the sea close to her house when her parents were still with her. "I'm here with my sensei, and we will stay here for some time because of my training," Naruto replied. Asha frowned slightly since it meant that he would have to leave eventually. But she decided to ignore that thought for now and agreed to talk to him. "Oh, that's amazing, but who's your sensei?" Asha asked and rested on the edge of the floor, her legs hanging underneath. Naruto sat close. "He's Jiraiya, what about you two?" Naruto asked, interested in them. Asha turned to him, surprised. "Wait. Jiraiya? You mean Jiraiya of the Sannin?" she asked, surprised and almost shouted, and Fu was just as surprised. Naruto just nodded his head. Asha wondered how good at fighting Naruto must be and if he could train with him. "Wow, you're lucky, me and Asha train too," Fu replied, sitting in a branch to Ashara's left side looking at Naruto. Her head was resting on her hands, with the same cute smile on her face. "That's amazing, if you want, we can train, and with Jiraiya-sensei too, he wouldn't mind it," Naruto suggested, and both Asha and Fu nodded their heads in agreement. Naruto then turned to Asha, and he turned to Sirius. "It's good to meet you. Do you know any other Uzumaki?" he asked, hoping that there were other of their people alive. Asha lowered her head at the question. She thought about her parents. Naruto understood it and felt slightly ashamed of reminding her of something terrible. "I'm sorry, Naruto was interrupted by Ashera. "Is fine, I understand. Well, me parents were both Uzumaki," she replied and turned to look at Naruto. What about you? She asked hopefully that Naruto had anyone in his life. Naruto shook his head, despite knowing it still hurt him to talk about them for many years now. My mother was an Uzumaki, her name was Kushina. My father, on the other hand, I don't really know who his parents were, and my sensei doesn't know it either. Naruto replied, his hands on his knees, looking down at the grass below. Ashera raised an eyebrow at the name Naruto mentioned about his mother. She could have sworn that she had heard that name before. Noticing the atmosphere around had turned too much gray for her taste. So, friend Naruto, tell us something joyful about your life, Fu asked, and hoping his life had been easier. Naruto rubbed his red hair and turned to look at Fu with a smile, and he didn't want to complain and talk about the bad times of his life, so he decided to talk about the good times. Naruto then started talking about his life in Hidden Leaf Village, but avoiding the part of getting beaten, and didn't mention every single insult he got. Ashera could feel he wasn't telling the whole truth but decided to ignore since everyone had the right to have secrets and probably was too bad to talk about it. Naruto kept talking for like an hour. This one time, Gamabunta and I made a prank. Fukasaku told Sensei that I was going to train in a hazardous water in Mount Mayaboku. When he got there, he saw Gamabunta washing, and he immediately yelled at Sensei for trying to spy on him, Naruto said, and they all shared a laugh. Ashera couldn't help but feel the warm chakra of Naruto, and she didn't know why it felt so good and relaxing. It felt warm, almost like looking at the sun. Fu wiped the tears with her hand from laughing and decided to ask a question. So I take it you and Furball are good friends? Fu asked since, from Komiyai's words, Kyubi was the last Bijou to expect to be friendly towards a human. Hell, he wasn't even familiar with his brothers and sisters. Maybe he has changed, and did you just call him Furball? Chomei asked Fu, since calling him in a disrespectful manner wasn't the wisest course of action. Fu just grinned at her response and looked at Naruto. He nodded his head. Yes, Kurama and I are perfect friends, we have been for 3 years now, he replied. Wow, I never expected Kurama of all Bijou to be friendly, and since he knows his name, it means he trusts him, Chomei said, impressed with Naruto. Naruto then turned to Ashera. What about you? How did you end up here? He asked her. Asha lowered her gaze slightly but decided to respond to her fellow clan member. Ashera then explained how it had happened, how she had ended up in Taki, and how she had become friends with Fu up to this point. Naruto listened without interrupting during the whole talk and wondered from which village the shinobis attacked her family and tried to kidnap her. He wondered if Tojiji had any idea and decided to ask him about it later. I'm really sorry about your family, Ashera. Naruto apologized with a sincere tone. Asha thanked him and told him that was nothing for him to apologize for. So you will become a Konoha shinobi? Fu asked since, from what she understood, Naruto would soon return to Konoha and start the academy and become a shinobi of Hidden Leaf Village. She hoped for him to stay here as long as possible. It wasn't every day that you meet a fellow Jinchuriki. And a good as well. I don't think I will stay in the village for that long, I'm still not strong enough, but once I will rebuild my homeland and bring back the Uzumaki clan, Naruto stated with passion in every word that taken by surprise both Asha and Fu. The redhead girl smiled at him, and she had the same idea, finding every Uzumaki and rebuilding their home as strong as it was before. And make the ones that destroyed her family pay. She could tell Naruto meant every word he said. Well, it seems we have the same objective, Naruto, she said smiling. Tell me, Naruto, are you good with Fuinjutsu? She asked since Fuinjutsu was the essential art in the world and one of the strongest. Naruto grinned and nodded his head. I'm at level 4, what about you? Ashera asked curiously, her fingers playing with her hair that rested on her shoulders. Level V, Jiraiya-sensei is a Fuinjutsu master, he's a good help, if you want, you can ask sensei to help. I'm sure he will be able to help you, Naruto replied, then his eyes went to the red seal on her wrist. Ashera felt honored to be trained by a Sannin and not to mention trained in Fuinjutsu. What is this seal? Naruto asked, staring at the seal. From what he could see, the seal looked like a storage seal but way too advanced, and second, it had a few writing that made it look like something other than storage seal. I really don't know. When my mum passed away, this seal appeared in my wrist and is like advancing. In the beginning, it had an empty circle in the center, but now as you can see it is different, Asha replied. The empty circle had started growing what looked like small branches from 4 different locations, and slowly increasing to the circle's center. Right now, they had grown only halfway through the ring. Naruto softly touched her wrist, and Asha couldn't help but blush at his touch. Fu seemed to notice it and started grinning from ear to ear. Well, maybe Jiraiya-sensei can take a look, Naruto suggested and turned to look at Fu. How's Chome? He asked the green-haired girl. Well, she's good, she's a good company to have around and is funny, Fu replied kindly with a smile and closed eyes. Do you like Taki? Naruto asked slightly more seriously. Asha and Fu noticed that. Fu thought how to answer, but she knew he would understand if she told the truth of how things are around here. Not really the best place, the people here are just as stupid as the people in your village, Ashera replied since no one really liked Fu, except Lord Shiboku, all the others treated her like an outcast, like a demon, and since Ashera spent time with her, people had started looking at her in the wrong way too, not that it bothered her that much. Naruto understood what it meant, and sometimes he dreamed of the night when they attacked him. The names they called him, he had tried to forget it but couldn't, no matter how hard he tried. His scars in his mind made sure of that. I understand, Fu, then I would like to be your friends, Naruto said, smiling at both of them. Fu smiled, and so did Asha, her purple eyes shining from the light shining on her face. I want to be your friend too, friend Naruto, she replied and pulled a fist close to Naruto. He smiled and bumped his fist with hers. Suddenly he wasn't in the same place anymore, and he saw himself standing at the top of Kurama's head. Naruto looked around to see empty places, shadows covering the corners, and his eyes went to the center of the room. There were 3 circles, one smaller than the other. Torches around the wall. Naruto was about to ask where they were when he saw Fu and who he assumed was Chome slowly showing up from the corner. Chome had 6 enormous green wings with orange color at the edge. Dark veins spread through the wings, and one big green tail at the bottom of Chome. Her upper body looked blue color, and her lower body was orange and orange eyes like Fu. She had 6 limbs close to her head and 2 what looked like small spikes coming out of her shoulders. Her eyes turned to look at Kurama at Naruto. It'd been some time Kurama, to be honest, I never expected you ever to have a good friendship with your Jinchuriki, Chome spoke, her voice sounding happy. Kurama growled slightly. He's a good brat, and not to mention he's an Uzumaki. I have seen for 7 years now, and I know the brat has a good head on his shoulders, Kurama replied. Naruto's eyes twitched at being called a brat but decided to let it slide for now. Fu eyed the big fox in front of her. I have to be honest, you're a very impressive furball, Fu suddenly said, smiling at Kurama, who growled loudly and released a bit of ki. Watch your mouth, little brat, and no one dares to call me that and to get away without getting wet, Kurama threatened, raising his voice and showing his teeth. Fu just smiled with her cute smile and didn't look bothered by the ki. I have trained Fu to stand my ki. The amount you're leaking is small for her, Chome informed him and turned to look at Naruto. You seem to be a good boy, young Uzumaki, and I'm curious to see where your road will lead, Chome said seriously and was very interested to know why Kurama has suddenly changed his attitude and decided to be friendly. Suddenly they were back in the forest. Asha was looking at them strangely. Fu moved away from her fist. What happened? Asha asked. She knew that sometimes Fu would like zoomed out when she talked with Chome, but it had been almost 30 minutes since they bumped their fists. Chome wanted to meet Furball, Fu replied. Naruto heard the growl of Kurama at being called like that from the little brat. Asha nodded in understanding and turned to look at Naruto. Hey Naruto, I saw your sword when you zoomed out, and it is very similar to mine, she said and pulled out her still-sheathed sword and put it on the floor close to Naruto. He pulled out his own and put it close to hers and had to admit that they were similar, both had the phoenix symbol at the top of the scabbard. Yes, you're right, mine belonged to my mother, she was known as the Red Death of Konoha, Naruto replied with pride in his voice. Asha was impressed to hear that. Wow, your mother must have been an excellent kunoichi, Asha said and putting her sword behind her back. Naruto gave her a sad smile and nodded his head, and tightened his sword to his hip. He then jumped down to the ground. How about a spar? Naruto suggested. Both Asha and Fu nodded in agreement and followed him. They soon reached the lake close to Fu's house. Naruto could see the waterfall a bit further away and thought that would be an excellent place to train his elemental manipulation of wind style. Who's first? Ashera asked. Naruto turned to look at them. He shrugged his shoulders since he had no problems with whoever was his first opponent. Fu told Asha to go first since she was better than her in Kenjutsu. Asha walked closer, and her hand went to the pommel of her sword, and so did Naruto's hand. Suddenly was only silence. Blue eyes looked at the purple eyes of Asha, whose gaze didn't move away. The wind flew around them, their hair dancing with the wind. Naruto noticed the stand of Asha. A leaf slowly started falling from a nearby tree, the leaf finally dropped, and they rushed towards each other. Yagura! A group of 6 shinobi raced silently through the treetops. The leader of this group appeared to be a male with a head of messy, light brown hair, pink eyes, and a scar running from under his left eye down his cheek. Despite his youthful appearance, he held a powerful air around him. He was none other than Yagura, the Yondaime Mizukage. Yagura stopped as he and his squadron reached the Hai no Kuni border. Raising his hand, he signaled for his group to halt. His eyes quickly scanned the area and decided that the area was safe. He slowly turned to face the 5 shinobi that had accompanied him. "Well, I guess this is where we part," he announced. Observing their expressions, he noted that a few of them were showing reluctance at his words. Sighing, he asked, "What is it?" Haru was her name. One shinobi glanced at her companions before nervously standing forward and bowing her head. She was the youngest of his guards but the bravest. She was 17 years old, purple hair tightened to a ponytail. With all due respect Mizukage-sama, we believe this is too dangerous for you to go into Konoha's territory without an escort, she breathed out while still having her head down. "Raise your head," she heard the Mizukage command. Doing as he ordered, she stepped back into line with the rest of her squadron. Yagura narrowed his eyes and gave each of the shinobi in front of him a glance. "Do you know what we are doing here?" he asked. "To escort you to the Fire Country's border, sir." They replied in unison. "Yes, the border," he repeated. "So now," he continued, gesturing in the direction they came from, "you have to go back to Mizu no Kuni." Once again, they began to look reluctant, and Haru spoke up. "But what if you run into an enemy ninja? They might attack you, and we are very far from Mizu no Kuni." "You could." Yagura interrupted, "I am here on the Hokage's wishes, so I should be fine, and even if something does happen, do you truly believe that I cannot look after myself?" he said, frowning. "I'm not a child." He gazed at the shinobi through blank eyes before nodding and speaking again. "You will come to this spot in 1 week exactly, and I will return then." "Hi. Alright, now you will go back to Mizu no Kuni and tell Kuroya that the escort was a success." "Hi." Dismissed. Haru hesitated but soon left. The shinobi in front of him immediately disappeared on his word, and he could feel their presence getting further away. Yagura turned back to face the border of Hai no Kuni before he began running towards Konoha. "Mizukage-sama, a letter has come for you from Konoha." Yagura glanced up from his paperwork and took in the man in front of him. "Is that so?" Yagura asked before taking the letter from the messenger's outstretched hand. "When did this arrive?" he asked, opening the letter. "Just this morning," the man replied. "I see," he replied as he began to read the letter. Suddenly, a wide grin split the Mizukage's face. "Interesting," he whispered to himself. Looking up, he addressed the messenger. "You're dismissed, but before you go, tell Kuroya to come here." "Hi." The man replied before shunsing away. A few minutes had passed when a new man appeared before the Mizukage. He had plain brown eyes and long black hair that covered most of his face, however, a long scar that ran down the entirety of the right side of his face was still visible. He looked straight at Yagura's eyes, something most people would not do when talking to the Yondaime Mizukage. His eyes were blank, showing no emotions. "You summoned me, Mizukage-sama?" he asked unflinchingly. "Kuroya, I told you not to call me that." "Call me Yagura," Yagura said, crossing his arms in front of himself. Kuroya gazed at Yagura before replying, "You summoned me, Yagura-sama." Yagura sighed before continuing, "Yes, I just wanted to tell you that, in 2 weeks, I will be leaving," he said, a slight smirk playing on his lips. Kuroya's eyes stayed blank, but Yagura had known him for a long time that he could tell by the way his body stiffened that he was surprised by this news. "Leaving to where exactly? Why don't you see for yourself?" Yagura said, extending the letter to him. Kuroya stood, approached Yagura, and took the letter from him. He read the letter in silence before looking up at Yagura. "You're not going to agree to this, are you?" he asked in disbelief, shaking the letter slightly. "These terms are ridiculous, it's obviously a trap." "Or, maybe it's a genuine request," Yagura countered while standing and walking to Kuroya, taking the letter from him. "Yondaime Mizukage," he read out loud, "I am writing to you to request a meeting. This meeting will be, of course, a peaceful one, as I wish to establish an alliance between both Mizu no Kuni and Hai no Kuni. To do this, however, we must meet in person, therefore, I have made the following arrangements. Firstly, I have arranged for the meeting to take place in Konoha, 2 weeks from the time you receive this letter. This meeting, as I already stated, will be a peaceful one, and I am well aware of your country's reputation as the Bloody Mist Village, so I request that you come alone as to not disturb the peace in Konoha. Yagura snorted at this but continued reading. This means no escorts. However, rest assured, you will not be attacked by any Konoha shinobi while in our borders. Sincerely, the Sandaime Hokage. Yagura finished reading the letter before glancing back at Kuroya. Kuroya shook his head before saying, I know there's nothing I can say to stop you once you've made up your mind, so do whatever you want. Yagura kept running but could feel something wasn't right. I don't like this, Yagura, Isabu suddenly said. Yagura was about to reply that everything would be fine when he stopped running and saw 2 figures walking towards him. Slowly, dark cloaks with red clouds slowly revealed. Yagura knew one of them. I didn't expect to see you here, Juzo, the Mizukage called his former shinobi. The said shinobi gritted his teeth and glanced at the man beside him. Yagura noticed the man was actually young, dark hair, and Sharingan, long way from home. Itachi Uchiha, Yagura said, gripping his staff, ready to attack. Itachi didn't react to being called by his name. I will need your help, my friend, Yagura said mentally, and his body started covering in red chakra, 2 tails slowly growing behind his back. Let's show them who's boss, Isabu said with Yagura's body before charging. Chapter 23, Feeling of Death. Naruto rushed at Ashera, his sword flew to her torso, but she quickly blocked it with her sword. They looked at each other before swinging again. Asha blocked his swing and backed away. 10 feet away, she put a smile on her face. Kenjutsu was her favorite way of fighting. She put her sword behind her hips and ran at Naruto with all her speed. Her speed was easily low chunin. She lowered her whole body slightly. Her blade almost touched the ground before swinging upwards towards Naruto. His hands moved quickly and blocked the swing. The sound of metal hitting metal was heard throughout the forest. Ashera promptly took a step back and rolled, trying to him from behind. Naruto lowered his whole body before her sword made contact. Naruto smiled, impressed before swinging again. Asha blocked and added chakra to her sword, making it more sharp and deadly. Naruto noticed it and added wind in his swords, pushing the edge to shine and look slightly like invisible flames dancing around the blade. Asha saw and took 3 steps back. That sword like that could easily cut down trees. She put her right hand slightly behind her body, her sword behind her, and her left hand slowly going to the pommel. Naruto nodded before they rushed and clashed their sword together. Asha could see Naruto was faster than her and had more strength, but his fighting skills in Kenjutsu was easy to predict. She swung, and Naruto blocked and kicked her in the stomach. She made a hand sign, and her weight seals in her arms and legs released. Fu watched from afar, impressed since Asha had not once released her weights, only increasing them as time went on. She had not once released them with her, and to see her actual speed was something she was looking forward to, but she was curious for her new friend too. She could tell Naruto had more to show, and she was looking forward to what else he could do. Naruto understood she had released her weights and wondered if he should do the same, but then he shook his head. He wanted to see his speed against her with his weights on. Asha then ran at Naruto with medium chunin speed. She swung faster, and Naruto returned to the offensive. She swung. He could keep up, swing after swing. Naruto blocked all of them since he wanted to test his own speed against her, but what the problem was is he didn't have any style to use in Kenjutsu. Asha, on the other hand, looked to know what she was doing. Naruto blocked another attack and tried to attack, but she blocked it and immediately moved again. Her swing cut slightly in his palm. Naruto backed away and looked at his hand. Blood started leaking. Asha immediately stopped attacking and had a look of concern. Naruto just raised his hand, telling her that it was okay. She then noticed that Naruto didn't moan or yell despite the small wound. He didn't even look in pain, and that was a relief to her. She walked closer and softly touched his hand. Asha saw the wound slowly healing. After a minute, the cut was fully recovered, and Naruto looked up at Asha. She was thankful that the Kyuubi was healing Naruto, the same how Chomei healed Fu. Excellent fight, Ashera, he said to her, impressed. She smiled back, but she knew he had weight seals, which meant she wouldn't be able to win if he had released them. Thank you, Naruto, but next time we fight, you will have to fight me without weights, she replied shyly. Naruto nodded in understanding and turned his head to Fu, who flew close to them. My turn now, she said and pulled out her short sword. Naruto grabbed his sword in his right hand. The palm didn't hurt anymore. He gripped the pommel of the sword tightly, wanting to see if it hurt. feeling no pain. His blue eyes looked at Fu's orange ones. Later, Fu was breathing heavily, her hands on her knees. It had been 6 hours since Naruto had started sparring with them. And so far, he had more winning with Asha, 1 lose with her, and 4 wins since he released his weights. Fu had failed every time, but both Asha and Naruto had said she was good in Kenjutsu despite starting it only for 7 months. Fu had removed her weights in her arms and legs, she reached low Chunin speed without them. But she hadn't used her chakra cloak during the spar. Chome had told her that she needed to better herself and not always depend on her chakra. Fu fully agreed with it. But if she would use her chakra cloak, she could reach high Chunin speed. She wondered if Naruto could use the cloak as well but decided to ask some other day. Right now, she was resting her head against the grass. Asha had fallen asleep in the treehouse, and Naruto was resting his head against the tree, his blue eyes still open. "Where's your sensei Naruto?" Fu suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Her right eye is slightly open, and looking at Naruto. She wanted to know more about her new friend, but she wanted to meet Jiraiya the Sannin as well. She wondered how strong he was and if all 3 of them could actually do something against someone like him. He snorted and stretched his arms and legs. "I don't really know, he was supposed to talk with Lord Shiboku, but I wonder what is taking him so long," Naruto replied, annoyed that his sensei hadn't found him yet. He would usually always find him, most would take up to 30 minutes to be found by him, but now it had been 7 hours since he had left the office. Naruto decided to go back to the village and search for him when he felt his chakra coming towards their location. Naruto grinned and just decided to sit down again. Fu noticed his behavior and was about to ask when a voice was suddenly heard. "I see you have made a friend." Naruto Fu looked up at a branch in front of her, a man standing. She didn't need an introduction to know who this one was. "Well, yes, Fu and Ashera are excellent friends," Naruto replied, smiling, his hands behind his head. Jiraiya raised an eyebrow at the unknown name. Lord Shibuki told him that Nanabai Jinchuriki's name was Fu. "Who's this Ashera?" Jiraiya asked and landed in front of Naruto. "She's an Uzumaki like me, Jiraiya-sensei," he said enthusiastically, his hands fist. Jiraiya looked surprised to hear that Taki had an Uzumaki. Jiraiya could see how happy Naruto seemed to be because of it, and he felt happy for his godson. "Well, introduce me to her then," Jiraiya said, and Naruto jumped at the treehouse and walked inside. Jiraiya crossed his arms and turned to see Fu smiling and walking closer. "Naruto talked a lot about you. You must be an awesome shinobi," Fu said and wondered how strong Jiraiya of the Sannin was. Jiraiya kept quiet and saw Naruto come out. Close to him was a redhead girl. Just looking at her, Jiraiya knew this one was an Uzumaki. He wondered if she had the same chakra chains as Naruto. Ashera jumped down with Naruto to see an older man with long white hair, 2 red lines trailing down his face. She could feel this one was strong, powerful. She bowed her head respectfully. "It's good to meet you, Jiraiya-sama," she greeted him respectfully. Jiraiya felt nervous about her behavior. "No need for that. Ashera was it, every friend of Naruto is a friend of mine," he stated. She smiled and raised her head. Jiraiya smiled back, and Naruto told him more about Ashera and Fu. He noticed him calling her Asha but decided to ignore it for now. After a long talk, he heard how they trained in Kenjutsu, and he saw that Ashera was good at Fuinjutsu. But then Ashera suddenly asked something he didn't need asking. "I heard you're the author of a book called Ika Ika Paradise," Ashera suddenly asked, her purple eyes looking at him. This caught Naruto's attention as well, since he had noticed that title in a few books of Tojiji and wondered what the books were all about. He knew the book was famous. From the cities he had visited, he had seen the book in every single shop, and usually were only a few left. Naruto would usually try to buy it, but he was training and had ignored it for now. Jiraiya started sweating, feeling the gaze of all 3 children in front of him. Rubbing his hand against his hair. "Oh. Have you read it?" Jiraiya asked, stuttering. He wondered how the likes of Tsunade would react, and he hoped to God that she hadn't read it. Asha shook her head, much to his relief. "No, but I saw that it sold very fast, but the seller told me I couldn't buy it since I'm not old enough. Can I borrow it from you?" she asked kindly with puppy eyes. Jiraiya started sweating even more. He could see Naruto was curious as well, but Kushina would kill him from beyond the grave and then torture his soul for eternity if he dared to give him the book, and second, all 3 were still very young. Maybe when they become genin. I can't give it, but you can read it once you become a genin, Jiraiya replied fast, sighing in relief thinking that this was over. All three frowned at his reply. Naruto was about to ask again, but Jiraiya-sensei raised his hand. How about I teach you in Fuinjutsu, Asha? Since Naruto mentioned you liked it, the mention of training in Fuinjutsu immediately brought a smile to her face. Yes, we can start now, Databane, she shouted happily. Jiraiya couldn't help but feel a familiar feeling with what she said. He sighed, pinching the bridge in his nose and followed her in the treehouse to train her in Fuinjutsu. After they left, Naruto turned to Fu and decided to help her in her ninjutsu. Fu, since you have Chome means, you can use Shadow Clone's jutsu to help your training, Naruto stated. Fu raised an eyebrow, not understanding where he was going with it. Naruto then explained how Shadow Clones worked and how she could train faster. Fu beamed but then asks. What about Asha-chan? She could use this as well, she quickly added. I'm not sure if Asha can use it, she might be able to use 2 to 3, but for a very short time, we have our friends to help us, but she doesn't, Naruto explained, already feeling bad that Asha couldn't use it. Fu frowned but still thought that her friend would significantly improve from that jutsu. I will show her as well but tell her to use only 2 clones max, Naruto suggested, and Fu nodded but still not liking it. Naruto explained how to do the jutsu, and he himself made 100 clones to help in the last fire elemental manipulation training and 100 clones for water. Naruto was sure that would be easier with all the amount of water around Taki. Yagura. He rushed at his former shinobi of Kiri. Juzo brought up Kubikurabocho to block his claw, which was almost like a sword itself. His giant sword swung towards his head, but he used his right hand to block it before punching him in the chest and throwing him across a tree. He tried to rush at him again. When Itachi showed up in front of him with a kunai, he blocked his claw with his kunai much to Jinchuriki's surprise. Yagura jumped away from him before landing on his feet and started doing hand signs. Itachi understood what he was about to do and started doing hand signs. Water style, wave rush. Fire style, fireball. Yagura threw a massive amount of water from his mouth, Itachi threw a giant fireball. Both jutsus collided, creating considerable steam around. Itachi's fireball was able to keep up with his water jutsu, much to the surprise of Yagura, who was sure that his jutsu would be superior. Gritting his teeth, Yagura was starting to get annoyed. Time to end this, Yagura said with Ispabu's voice before coiling himself with his 2 tails around him. Yagura was enveloped in a blackish-purple barrier that blocked Juzo's view of Yagura. A second later, the barrier exploded with a roar, and their eyes widened to what they saw. It was the Mizukage, however, it wasn't the one they knew. Yagura was now completely enveloped in the Isabu's chakra as it became his own skin. His head was a shell to protect it, and he had 3 tails in his back. This was his version 2 cloak, and he looked like a miniature Isabu. Juzo moved close to Itachi, who could see the new form of the Mizukage. He knew this was a problem, and the only way to counter was with Mangekyo Sharingan. Steam moved away from the Jinchuriki. Juzo felt frozen from fear seeing what was in front of them. They both saw and felt the overwhelming chakra. Sweat rolled down Juzo's forehead. His hands started shaking. They didn't have time to think as Isabu was preparing for his next attack. His tails were coiled around Isabu, ending just above his head. Blue and red chakra were seen floating in the air. Suddenly all the chakra started compressing until it formed a perfect sphere still hovering midair. Itachi's eyes turned Mangekyo, which looked like a 3-blade shuriken. He knew what the Mangekyo would do to him, but he needed it now. Meet your end, Isabu yelled and threw the bomb towards them. The ground started shaking, the ground beneath the bomb split like paper, throwing debris around the air. Juzo used his big sword to block the attack without knowing what else to do, which exploded in contact. Itachi was thrown away from the force of the explosion, his black cloak had burned in a few places, and his hands were screaming from pain. He quickly stood up to see Juzo against a tree, but his sword had pierced him in the stomach, blood coming from his mouth and his wound. He slowly turned his head to Itachi. Itachi, are you, run, he warned him. Itachi turned to see the Mizukage preparing another bomb. Itachi focused his chakra on his right eye, blood slowly started rolling down his right eye like tears. Amaterasu, Itachi whispered, and the Jinchuriki was engulfed in black flames. He started screaming in agony and shaking his head and body, trying to remove the flames from him. Not knowing what else to, Yagura ran away. Itachi released a sigh of relief and turned to his comrade, and his blood had spread all over the ground. Jozu looked at him with a slight smirk on his face. "Don't look at me like that, you don't need to be a medical shinobi to know my time has ended," he said, struggling as his legs started feeling numb, his hands slowly losing strength. "Do you have any last words?" Itachi asked him. He smiled through his teeth. "I want my sword with them." His hand fallen in the ground. His eyes stopped moving. Itachi said a small prayer and put the handle of his sword in his hand. Later, Yagura was panting, he returned normal, his skin burned in several places, and he started coughing. While he was running away, Isabu told him to turn his body in the first form chakra cloak. After doing that, the black flames had moved away from his skin and started burning the chakra cloak instead. Yagura then slowly had made the part burning his chakra fall in the ground. It took a lot of effort, but he finally got rid of the damn thing, but he had lost a lot of chakras, even Isabu told him to rest. And the pain around his body wasn't stopping. His head resting against a tree, he decided to go back to his village when he felt a presence behind him. Despite the pain, he stood up and turned around to see a man with a mask, the same black cloak with red clouds. His mask covered his whole face, except his right eye. The mask looked orange with lines that collided in the right eye, almost like a spiral. Looking closer, he saw that it was a Sharingan. Backing away, he grabbed his staff tightly. "Who are you?" the young Mizukichi demanded. His whole body was screaming from pain, and he knew he couldn't do much right now. The man just stood there and chuckled at his question. "Who am I doesn't matter, soon the Hidden Mist Village will pay for what they have done," he stated with a deep tone, his voice full of hatred. He pointed the finger at Mizukichi before Yagura could do anything. He felt everything go dark. Isabu. He was resting on the floor, and he had spent a lot of chakra in the fight. That's when he felt a presence other than Yagura inside the seal. Looking around, he saw a man slowly walking out of the shadows, his eyes narrowed, and he clenched his teeth. "Who are you, mortal?" Isabu asked furiously that someone would come here. Only Yagura had that right and not this mortal. The man laughed, his hand moved to his mask and moved his mask to his left side, showing his fully matured Sharingan. "I'm Uchiha Madara," the man stated before Isabu felt his whole body felt like in a fire. In front of his vision was the Sharingan, he couldn't shake that vision away. He tried it and yelled at the top of his lungs, his eyes turned to Sharingan, and everything went dark. Naruto, after 5 months. He stood in front of the waterfall, multi-clones beside him, they all had their hands on the water, trying to split the waterfall. Naruto was still in Taki. Lord Shiboku had allowed him to stay here for as long as he wished. Jiraiya-sensei knew him well. His bond with Ashera and Fu had grown. Learning Shadow Clone Jutsu, Fu had started training her elemental manipulation with the help of Jiraiya. Ashera, on the other hand, because of her Uzumaki blood, she had a large amount of chakra despite not being a Jinchuriki. Toji had stated that she had a low Jonin level of chakra. Because of that, Ashera could use shadow clones to train, but only one clone, Jiraiya, had warned her that it would be dangerous to use more than one. Asha had not complained, she had used the clone to start training her elemental manipulation. Jiraiya had shown her what she needed to do, and both he and Naruto were surprised to see she had fire and water affinity. The old Sannin then had told them that Fu had high wind affinity, and Ashera had high water affinity. One thing that had surprised Naruto was during a spar with Ashera. Naruto used his sword to swing at her chest, she took 2 steps away, the blade barely missing her. Jiraiya was keeping his eyes on them. His eyes were like a hawk looking at every move they made. Close to him was Fu, smiling at them. Naruto suddenly used his red chakra chains to grab her sword, and his chains tightened around her sword. The shock was written all over her face, but before he could do anything, he saw silver chains flying towards him and tightened around his sword. He looked to see the chains coming out of her left sleeve. Ashera was smirking at him. Naruto smiled at her, and she smiled back at him, his chains returned to his chest. Naruto was surprised to see that but quickly understood that she was an Uzumaki too. He wondered if there was any other Uzumaki outside beside him and Asha. He hoped that there were. But he wondered if he would ever meet them even if they were out there. Naruto kept trying, but the damn waterfall wasn't splitting in half, he was panting. He had been here for 4 hours now. Jiraiya-sensei had changed his weights again, and he now wore 250 pounds on his legs and 220 pounds on his arms. The same goes for Fu and Ashera. He also warned them not to try to raise their weights too much immediately, which would cause damage to their bodies. Naruto had completed his water and fire training, now, he only needed wind and earth. Since he had arrived here, Naruto had not once used with style. Not that he didn't trust Asha and Fu, but he wanted to wait until he got better at it. With the help of Jiraiya-sensei, Asha had quickly reached level V in Fuinjutsu. Fu, on the other hand, wasn't really fond of Fuinjutsu, but she had completed level 1 with the help of Jiraiya-sensei since she wanted to know how to seal things to travel when in missions, or just traveling around the elemental nations. Naruto, you will soon return to the village, what is wrong? Kurama suddenly asked him. He could feel the anxiety rising slowly in Naruto the more closer it got for him to return. Naruto gritted his teeth tightly. After 4 months, he would return to Hidden Leaf Village, and he wasn't looking forward to it. Despite having friends there, he didn't want to see their stares again, their insults. And if anyone was dumb enough to try and hurt him, he would show them why Uzumaki clan is strong. I don't want to talk about it, Kurama, Naruto replied and focused on his training again. He had decided that his first jutsu to learn after completing his elemental manipulation would be Uzumaki style, Phoenix. It was one of the jutsus his mother had left him. He knew that it was a powerful one. Naruto had decided to tell Asha about the jutsu before he left. Grunting, he returned to his training. Itachi. He looked at the clear water in front of him, his body resting at the edge of a dock, his right leg hanging, his foot close to touching the water. The wind was flying around him, the seagulls flying high in the air. His Sharingan in his eyes as he heard footsteps behind him. Itachi didn't move, he just kept staring at the water. I will be teaming up with you starting today. My name is Kisame Hashigaki, former of the Hidden Mist, one of the 7 ninja swordsmen, so please do make your acquaintance, Kisame stated walked closer, a big sword resting on his shoulder. The sword was covered in bandages except for the handle, which looked like made of bones. And you're Itachi Uchiha, formerly of the Hidden Leaf. I've heard the rumors that you've slaughtered all of your fellow Uchiha clansmen, Kisame stated with a grin on his face. His face pale, his eyes like of a shark, with 3 small black marks going down from his eyes. I think that we are like you and I. That's the reason I wanted to be teamed with you in the Akatsuki. It's really indescribable, isn't it? Killing your comrade is quite a sensation, wouldn't you say so? Itachi Kisame taunted him. Hearing those words, Itachi remembered his parents, visions of his parents dead by his hands, his little brother crying, and Izumi smiling at him and telling him that she loved him. You talk a lot, Itachi interjected, his voice deep and filled with a hint of grief. You don't understand me. You don't even understand yourself. You were just a thug who got lost in the mist and ended up here. You can't even control where you're going. Am I wrong? Itachi asked. Kisame gritted his teeth slightly and moved his sword close to Itachi's shoulder, but he didn't even flinch. He kept his gaze at sea in front of him. Do you want to know something interesting? Most sharks are ovoviviparous, which means that the eggs hatch inside the female's body before the young are born. However, with some kinds of sharks, the number of eggs that hatch will differ from the number of young that emerge out of the mother's belly. Do you know why that is? Kisame asked as a wave slammed against the dock. Because of cannibalism. Right from the moment they hatch, they start eating each other inside their mother's uterus. The fratricidal warfare begins as soon as they're born to each shark, all the others are just food to be eaten starting today. You are an Akatsuki member and my companion, so be wary of me, Kisame stated. Itachi slowly evolved his Sharingan to Mangekyo Sharingan. Same goes for you, he said with a promise on his words. Kisame chuckled at his words and moved away from his sword. Let's be friends and have some fun. Alright. And hope that we will not end up as each other's final opponents. No one who dares to raise their hand against a comrade ever dies a decent death. Remember that, Itachi stated, thinking of Izumi. Well, that means our fates are sealed. Seems you and I are depraved and worthless, Kisame said. Not true. We are both humans. Not fish. Itachi said and stood up and turned to look at Kisame and started walking away. No matter who you are, you do not truly know what kind of man you've become. Until you reach the very end. That's it for part 3. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.